an issue. Climate change wasn't here when my ancestors, I guess, first settled in this region. They say we had a migration story that brought our people to this region years ago, and if there's still societies out there. There's a medicine society. We know them as the Myeengun Society, and they tell a story that our people originated from the East Coast at one point, and there were 7 prophecies that led them to where we live today, and they migrated. Their first prophecy was around Montreal, where they said there was an island just outside of Montreal that was shaped like a turtle. That was their original destination, and they were to travel there and then find out where their next destination would be. They found out the second destination was Niagara Falls, the beautiful area where water flows endlessly through that, and they'll get their understanding of where to go next, and they end up near Chicago, and then up toward Lake Superior over to Wisconsin, where they were told that you need to find a place where food grows on water. And so they were searching for this food that grew on water, and they reached their destination in Wisconsin, where they found the wild rice. And in that process, many of the elders who couldn't travel any longer created homes along that way, and we ended up being pretty much predominantly in the area of the Great Lakes region. Our people have been here since time immemorial. And during that time, we were always reminded of our traditional stories and our responsibility to the land, and to have that ability to hold that strength through the stories of our elders and the teachings of those wisdom keepers. We were able to support our role here. And one of the first and most demanding roles that we were told to be responsible for was to make sure our Mother Earth stays healthy. Give it all it requires to continue on for generations to come, so that every generation forward will have clean water, will have clean air, will have everything that provides sustenance for the living. But never, ever consider yourself higher or above all other parts of creation. And so we had to find that balance within ourselves in order to build upon our own understanding of who we are. And during that time, we knew that there was a specific role for us. Over time, we know that things changed with the invention of technology, boats and other things that would help us, travel. Nations came to this beautiful land called Turtle Island. We've named it Turtle Island for a specific reason, but on this Turtle Island, we met with newcomers to this land who had different ideas, had different understandings of their teaching. But we didn't always resist those temptations to use that new technology. Our people were always, looking for new and innovative ways to help things, and we became very close to the newcomers to this land. We became very comfortable. In fact, we started sharing technology. We started sharing the ways of our way of hunting, and they brought us technology such as the firearms and different things that they have invented. And that was a cordial relationship. It started off in peace and friendship. And actually, I brought some of those historical events right in front of us about the wampum belts that tell the history of our people. And they're here for you to come and look at and maybe question and talk about, because I know you weren't given those in your history books. I'm doing a course now at the college that's going to talk about things that maybe weren't taught to you in the history books, but from an Indigenous lens. And during that time, we needed to build a thorough plan that's going to help us support the strength of keeping our Mother the Earth healthy. And we actually call her Mother for a very specific purpose. It's just like our own mothers.
when we come into this world, we need to be fed, we need to be cleansed, we need to have medicine when we're sick. And that's everything that our Mother, the Earth, provides for us, right from the day that Creator brings you to this world, right to the day that Creator takes you back to Creator's world. We have to treat the land as we would our mother and give her all the support and strength and determination that it takes to make sure that she's healthy for all of us. And so she's been given that role as our mother, and our nation has been blessed with those teachings for centuries. Our nation near London, Ontario, Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, along with our brothers and sisters from the Anishnawbe people throughout southern Ontario, had formed a huge family that allowed us to recall these stories. So we fast forward to a time when that relationship kind of changed. We know that there was a crucial time in our history when the native people of this land became the Indian problem. And those are the correct terms that were used during that time, when we were impeding the travel west to get to the place where they found gold. We were impeding that process, and we became a problem for many of the frontiersmen, the people who wanted to move past the Allegheny Mountains and right into the Mississippi River, where that was named the Indian country, where that royal proclamation was talked about. We would have that land. But during that process, you probably heard of people, notable chiefs like Sitting Bull and Cochise and Crazy Horse. Maybe you didn't know the prominence of what they were doing, but they were standing up for the rights of their people, because there was a treaty in place. There was an agreement between nations that we would have that land, but they kind of thought it was a problem now because they wanted to expand westerly. Chippewas of the Thames First Nation held a prominent role in the War of 1812. If it wasn't for our nation, you'd be standing in the United States of America right now, because we fought at the Battle of Longwoods, and we fought them back all the way to Detroit. A member of our nations was the prominent members, along with the Haudenosaunee people, along with other allies, were able to fight them back to Fort Detroit. And I'm very proud to be a part of this nation, because we've taken on some specific roles in history. We've taken on some very important roles that we lost many of our people in the process. So during that time, we had been put on reserves, what I guess has been labeled at some point corrals for our people to die off on. And then that Indian problem became even more exposed, because they said that even on reserves were still a problem. So they had to invent another way to exclude our people from this nation. They developed residential schools where they took our children from their families and their communities. And that was a very important time in our history, because if anybody in this room can speak their language, feel honored to do that, because there's nations in this country who were punished for doing so. There was laws against Native people from speaking our language, and they put a residential school right on our reserve, Mount Elgin Residential School. You might have heard of Mushhole in Brantford, the Mohawk Institute, but some people don't know that there was one place right on Chippewas of the Thames First Nation called Mount Elgin, where many of our members had to attend this school and were treated as what you've heard about residential schools, and probably even worse in a lot of cases, because residential school, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission just made this more public awareness about what took place in these schools. We still have people in our families who have been murdered or missing since those days, and they know that some of the bodies have been buried and incinerated behind these schools, and we're just locating these now. So it's been a very crucial time, and our population decreased quite rapidly during those days. But even more harsher was the fact that we couldn't even practice our ceremonies. We couldn't speak our language. And it was against the law right in this country. And when I think about that today, I think about what took place in South Africa, where apartheid was notable, but it happened right here in this country. A word that people don't like to use, but I have to use this word because that's how strong it was here in Canada. So we moved forward after residential schools, and the last one closed in 1996 in Saskatchewan, but we are still here. We're nations that are standing up and proud, regaining that language that you heard this morning, and revisiting the historical relationships that we had with the newcomers to this land. Chippewas Attempts First Nation has built within itself a pride that allows us to understand our history so that we can move forward. And most recently, we've taken on a role to do exactly what I mentioned, protect our mother, the earth. Our role here in our region is surrounded by a beautiful river called the Thames River. Gchi-Nbi in our language, it means Antler River. And we actually named our reserve after that beautiful river because that river provides us with sustenance. The pickerel that spawn in that river becomes our sustenance, and we use that for recreation and in our drinking water. So we have to honor this beautiful river that travels through our territory right alongside of our nation. And we found out back in the 70s, there was an application, but there was a pipeline that was put in that runs right from Montreal to Sarnia. You might be aware of Line 9 issue that has been recently approved to run a very lethal chemical through that pipeline called tar sands and bitumen oil. You know, that is very lethal. And if you look at the history of this oil, you'll find that it leaves devastation. We found out that this pipeline that was built in the 70s had a life expectancy of 40 years. It's been 40 years now, and they decided to put a different type of oil through it. That's more dangerous in a pipeline that we feel is ready at least some point to burst someplace along that line from Sarnia to Montreal. We took it upon ourselves, and members of our nation here did their research work. They wanted to find out what we can do. So we got to be interveners in the hearings that was taking place with the National Energy Board. We found out that there is a voice. We didn't even know we had a voice for a long time in these hearings, but because of the work of our nation, we will have that opportunity now to participate in some of these things that are taking place without our knowledge. We realized that the pipeline that came through in the 70s went in without our consultation. And during the 80s, when the Constitution was repatriated back to Canada, another member of our nation, Mr. Laurila, was prominent in getting Section 35 put into the Canadian Constitution, which protects Aboriginal rights. And we've been a part of this Constitution since then. And we triggered this in this Line 9 issue because we know that consultation needs to happen with First Nation, and the Government of Canada had never even given us a phone call to say that they were going to allow tar sands to run through our territory right under the Thames River. So we definitely had great concern. We definitely feel today that this oil that's traveling through this pipeline that's just outside of Cambridge out here, not right under the Grand River too, is posing imminent danger to our waterways, to the food that we require, and most recently, you know, the fact that they did not even live up to the Canadian Constitution to consult with our First Nation when they made this approval process. So we feel that it was kind of, I guess to any Canadian, when your government has not lived up to its own platform, its constitution when it comes to First Nations, well in our case, should be, an area of concern for all Canadians. And we've decided to challenge their dismissal of consultation with us. So we went to the Federal Court of Appeals last year, and we felt we had a really good case because the Crown, during that court case, did address that they never consulted with our First Nation on the pipeline issue. And we walked out of there, and a few weeks later we found out that out of the 3 judges, 2 decided against us and 1 decided with us. So we lost our case in the Federal Court of Appeals. We were not deterred, though. We knew that our issue is stronger than that. We knew that our laws, natural laws, is even more prominent than Canadian laws, than those type of laws, because to protect our Mother Earth was something that we were told we needed to do as Anishnawbe people to make sure our Mother Earth stays healthy. So we knew that the laws that are in this country, sometimes there even have to be stronger ones, and we call that the natural law. So we're going to actually use that as our platform to move forward. And we did an application to the Supreme Court of Canada. We were, I guess, only 5% of all applications make it actually to the Supreme Court, and we teamed up with a community in Nunavut called Clyde River, and we'll be going to the Supreme Court of Canada on November 30th of this year. This tells us very clearly that there is a requirement of having an allyship, because I think the understanding of what I mentioned about our protection of our Mother Earth and our going forward together needs all of us. We need to stand together on these issues because there's not a greater time in our history that we need to stand together as the human brothers and sisters of this land. Because I'm sure that each and every one of you care about your grandchildren, care about your children that aren't born yet. And when we leave this world, we want to make sure that it's a solid place for those generations, that they have clean water, that they have clean air, that they have food. And if we don't take our role in participating in doing that, what are we saying to ourselves? That we don't care about, what I see happening today in terms of corporations that want to extract resources for today's life and never mind the future generations to come. So we argue that point, that it's more important for us to help sustain our Mother the Earth in every way possible so that we can have that futuristic opportunity for our grandchildren. I love my grandchildren, and I want them to have water that they can drink. I want them to have land that some people don't have anymore. Stephen and I and a few other students just came back from New Orleans, where the Choctaw Nation has just lost 98% of their land due to oil extractions in the Gulf of Mexico. We found out very clearly that Hurricane Katrina didn't have to be as devastating as it was because of the effects of oil extraction in the Gulf. That now that the wetlands are eroding, the hurricanes are coming in stronger and doing devastating work on especially people that live in poverty. And that's where First Nation find themselves today in this country. We live in the most poverty communities that exist in Canada. And if an example of Katrina hit in Ward 9, where the poorest people of that part of the city lived, they were devastated. So it happens to the people who live in First Nation communities. Less health care, less coverage for education, less opportunity to share our traditional knowledge that I think is equated to a PhD or any scientific factor. That we need to have this ability to share this knowledge, because you can have all the research and science that can be provided for you, but the Native people are still the ones on the ground, still fishing, still know the land. I celebrate a family in our community called the Sturgeon family who spend a lot of their time hunting and fishing today. And I'm reminded of when the power outage hit a few years back. I would feel more comfortable with the Sturgeon family knowing how to get fish and how to than somebody with a PhD on those days, because they could show me where to get water, they could show me how to get food. And that's why I say that level of traditional knowledge is just as equal to the scientific knowledge that we're learning in universities and colleges today. So that's where that allyship needs to take effect. And we're willing to do that now. We're willing to share. For years we wouldn't do that because, take for example the Dreamcatcher that some of you have in your cars. You know, it's a little trinket of a toy, but it was a very sacred item to us. And at some point when we told that story, somebody looked at it at a different angle. They said, well, I could probably make some money off of that, sell it somewhere and use it. But we thought of it as a spiritual thing. We thought of it as something that would help our children. So the concepts have to come together. And we have no more time to argue, to fight over those things, but we need everybody in this room and every Canadian to at least live up to the Constitution that was delivered for this country and allow Section 35 to do what it's supposed to do and have consultation with First Nations. Just recently, Canada has adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is on your desks. We also need to have veto power within consultation process, within our traditional territories. We need to have this opportunity to share the knowledge, but we need to make sure that corporations, companies that bring dangers, such as tar sands oil to our region, has a balance to that. And we'll stand up for that because there's nothing more important for us is to keep this earth healthy and strong. So I want to applaud our workers again for being who they are and standing up for our nation as we take on the Supreme Court of Canada in our fight to keep our Mother Earth healthy. I want to thank you very much for...
It's wonderful to be here, and I just want to thank everybody for being here as well and giving us this opportunity to share some of our experiences. A little bit about myself. I'm really happy to be here. I'm a Mohawk, a Haudenosaunee Mohawk from Six Nations. Being at Laurier also, I spent a large part of my life here. I did my master's here some time ago, and more recently completed my doctorate degree in geography and environment resource studies, and my research was in water security for First Nations and collaborative governance. So a lot of that work involved examining the interrelationships between Western and Indigenous approaches to water specifically, but more broadly through our relationship with Mother Earth or from another perspective, perhaps our resources and our environment, just sort of different ways of saying the same thing. My current work, and I had the pleasure for about the last 20 years working with First Nations, my own and several other First Nations in Canada, and doing some representation on a national partnership project as well. So I feel very privileged to work at different levels and be able to most deeply work and continue to work with the communities and with the knowledge holders, faith keepers, medicine people, our spiritual leaders, and our political leaders. I'm very fortunate. So much of what I bring here today is not just my knowledge, it's knowledge that I've been blessed with gaining over my experiences, and often I'll tie in with that academic knowledge, because after spending 8 years on this campus, I have become an academic too. Most recently, actually, I've been appointed a position and taken a position as an assistant professor at the University of Guelph, so I look forward to working with students in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development. But when I was reflecting on here, if I had a few moments to share with people, I was thinking about this whole concept of allyship, because it's not a term that perhaps is in the geography realm. We talk about co-management, collaboration, governance, but in the social realm, it's really how do we become allies? How do we work together? And what I really started thinking about, and I was gathering this information, what really came back to me, and it was discussed a little bit this morning, is this whole notion of the original relationship. And then when I think about climate change, and I have some experience in that in my undergraduate research looking at global warming, where 20 years ago we were talking about maybe the planet's warming. Well, we know that now, and there's some researchers that will dispute that, but if we go on the premise it is happening, when it comes to climate change, the relationship amongst people, our relationship with Mother Earth, to me I see that as finally an opportunity that we have to go back to these original relationships. And as I was talking about before, the two-row wampum, as this is significant for the Haudenosaunee. This is a relationship that symbolizes the two journeys, the two rivers of life, that of the settlers or the newcomers and that of the Haudenosaunee people. And these two rivers were to say we would continue through the Haudenosaunee would travel on our vessel, on our canoe through the river of life, and our settlers or our newcomers would travel on their boat. Never to interfere with one another's ways, but recognizing that we had shared respect, peace, and friendship between us. So there's a lot of teachings in this, and for the Haudenosaunee, these are the original trees. These are the foundations of which our current relationships are still embedded. And often when you talk to the many of the traditional chiefs that I work with, we're still talking this. And this is what comes to the table when we remind those people that we're all treated people. We are all part of this two-row wampum. We all have a responsibility and a relationship under this. So when I thought about allyship, I'm thinking climate change, thinking global issues that transcend political boundaries, and it comes back to saying the solutions will be within something that requires all of us. So I think of that as our guiding principles for how we relate to one another, and how we relate to our physical, spiritual, and our world around us. Perhaps maybe as a geographer as well, and someone who works in resources, or I'll say I always use this, we talk about resources in geography, but from an Indigenous or an own way perspective, we talk about the gifts of Mother Earth and our responsibilities to those. So I think of the dish with one spoon. Another significant wampum or piece of history and piece of codified law to us of embedding our principles of natural law that says, as was explained to me about the dish with one spoon, is that a group of chiefs were sitting around it at one period of time eating beaver tail soup. And as they were deciding and agreeing on the wampum, the spirit of this wampum was to say, we have one dish of resources. All of our resources are in one dish. It's all of our responsibilities to take from that dish, take care of that dish, ensure that there's enough in that dish for others. And that we would use a spoon, an implement that was not sharp, we would not harm others. So this is the philosophy that today, when I work with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and we work with our partners, that we're still talking about. We're still talking about it's the dish with one spoon and how do we embed some of these other historic relations and treaties and notions into our current practices. So it's with the intent and the spirit of these original, laws or doctrines or practices which still resonate for Indigenous people, and many nations have their own such treaties and histories and ways of guiding current principles and decision making. So these are our foundational elements, and within each of these too, in our ceremonies and the understandings and the teachings are the original instructions for how we are to relate to our natural world. So this is where I really see the strength of the Indigenous communities, and where I think we're at a point now to bring the knowledge that's really needed to put into practice. Often what us academics will say, and I have to concur, I carry a PhD, but a lot of my time is thinking about the most sacred knowledge that is held in our elders and our knowledge holders that have continued this for generations. And as an academic, we're just learning another way of bringing that forward. But it's through that knowledge. So we think about sort of how these relationships were initially, and it's always to be reminded that that was embedded in a historic context. So when we talk about allyship now, it's very important that not only do we come to the relationship with the notion of peace, respect, and friendship, but that we're also understanding and cognizant of our histories and our past. And this is very important because as Indigenous people, whether Haudenosaunee, Anishnawbe, neutral people, or Indigenous peoples around the world, before colonization and before the newcomers, many of these nations had well-defined social, political, economic systems that were well-defined and were lived harmonious and were connected to the cycles of natures, the rhythm of natures, and were able to really have very successful civilizations. And through a long history or through a short period of colonialization, and I'll go as far as saying for the need to exploit the resources on Turtle Island, that began to happen. Some of the elements that were explained, such as the Indian Act, such as residential schools, such as some of these elements that became 4 phases of this altered relationship, how we went from these based on nation to nation and mutual respect to where we are. That's critical to know in these allyships, critical to know where we came from, to know where we're going to be. And there's lessons learned that can be learned in that. In fact, if you want to explore more, now we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that has brought forward a pathway and recommendations to how to support Indigenous communities, but historically we also had the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples, and that one also dictated a roadmap. So there's some very solid resources out there as well. But through these processes, I just want to explain that the historical context is quite critical. And I'm also reminded of when I was reflecting on what can I share in just a few minutes, I was thinking what some of the elders had told me. I'm coming as an academic doing research, saying how do we work collaboratively? How do we work to secure water security either for ourselves or for Mother Earth? And it's explained to me that when we talk about collaboration, that it's there, it's through these wampum belts, it's through these treaties. How we'll get to our future is there. And we're at a time now where we have to begin revisiting that. Particularly when we talk about supporting climate change and looking towards this. So given this historical context now, when I think about allyship, I think, what does this mean in practice? So it means considering that we return to these original relationships, that we begin to honor these historic obligations, obligations based on peace, friendship, and respect, truly come to the table wanting to be understanding, to say not that I have a way that I want to impose, but how do we come to one mind? How do we bring our minds together? Climate change is going to impact all of us. It's indifferent of our beliefs, it's indifferent of our worldviews, it's indifferent of where we live. It's going to affect Mother Earth, and it's time for all of us to come together. It's wonderful to see a group of people who I believe are positioned with that, in charge with that motivation to do so. So another thing that came to mind is one of the elders said to me when we were talking, a very practical thing. He says, Sheri, we go to the table, we talk about things, 3 things that come to me. I ask myself, he said, when I'm charged with a question or a decision, is this promoting a pathway towards peace? So that's the first thing he says we ask, and he reminds me that this is my responsibility as a Haudenosaunee woman as well. The next thing we consider, that is it impacting the environment and our natural systems, and we go further to say the plants, the animals, the winged creatures, the 4-legged creatures. What is this impacting our environment, our ecological systems? And the third thing is, what impact does this have on future generations? So I can give some people a small thing. If we all come to the table with those sort of common minds, saying those will be our principles of how we move forward when we talk about things, that might be a starting point that I can provide in just a few short minutes. I can take maybe another minute. I'm not sure where the time, because that's sort of like the theory, the history, and there's a couple suggestions. But then I also thought, what does this all mean in practice? It's nice to hear that. We have these relationships, we have these belts, we have some guiding principles, but I'll just share with you a couple examples of allyship as I see it in terms of practice on the ground and working on a day-to-day basis. One of my current contracts is I work for the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Chiefs Council. That is the traditional government of the Six Nations people. So it's not to be confused with an elected band council under the Indian Act. This is a council that was in place since time immemorial, before it was forcefully removed through the Indian Act. But these chiefs and clan mothers and faith keepers continue to persist, taking care of our people for the future. And one of the projects I work with the chiefs is with the city of Hamilton, where based on 1701 treaty rights, we've been able to establish a relationship for they call it co-management or co-governance, but we call it joint stewardship of the Red Hill Valley and the east end of Hamilton. So this is a green space in an urban area, and it's quite maybe one of the first set of agreements between a traditional government and a municipality in Canada. And through that, we've brought these sort of wampums to the table. We even have a wampum, and I left it on my desk in my office, and it's called the Fire of the Valley. And it talks about peace, friendship, and trust, and those are the principles that we come to the table and we work towards. But what we've been able to do with that is bring our minds together. We've put the law aside. We put that as municipal land from their perspective off the side. We put the idea that, or the notion that as Haudenosaunee, it's our land, that these are all people squatting on Haudenosaunee land or Indigenous lands, depending on which nation, because we're forced to draw lines and allocate time periods. But when we put that all aside, we just say we have a joint responsibility to take care of this land. And how do we do that? And I have to say kudos for the city, because they could have probably walked away from the table, but they came. And this was back in, I guess, 2003, the original agreements were talked about. And it took 3 years to sign them. But we're 10 years into it now, and some of the projects I work with, the residents of the city of Hamilton now have come to us. And one example is we were, I'll call it battling Hydro One to stop clear cutting in the Red Hill Valley in Hamilton, and the city couldn't stop it. The municipality, the province was okaying it through the Ministry of Natural Resources, through the Ministry of the Environment. I checked with the Niagara Escarpment Commission. Section 11.5 or something allowed them to do, I don't want to do their clear cutting, but it was the residents that said, you know what, can the Haudenosaunee help us? Do you have rights? Do you have Aboriginal and treaty rights? So we tried. Unfortunately, the clear cutting did go through, and now we're working on mitigation. But what came from this relationship is a true understanding and willingness to share and to work together. We had, first of all, shared values, shared goals. There was true mutual respect, where the people were saying, where the community members were saying they valued Indigenous knowledge. I didn't have to go in there and tell them how important it is and how we think holistically, and they just knew it already. They knew that this was an opportunity and that we were the ones that they should be trying to reach out to. There was a true understanding. I wanted to understand their context and what was challenging them in terms of their title to the land. Did they get title insurance? Why are they encroaching on the Red Hill Valley? Because they were actually, Hydro One cut right into their backyards because they had encroached. And so there's these legal elements, but there was a genuine willingness to learn and to work together, and I think that was really embodied some of the work that we've done. And the other thing we did is we leveraged our capabilities. I tried to understand what they could bring to the table, how they could contribute to this, and then tried to share them what we could do. And the other thing I think that really happened was having a champion from sort of both communities. We had a few city people, residents, that were bringing people together and working forward and working through their channels, and we were working through our channels. I was trying to work with the chiefs. I brought the medicine people down to assess the medicines. I brought an ecologist down. And we just did this, and none of us were getting paid for it, and none of us felt that we had a legal obligation to do this. We just knew we had a moral obligation to do what we could do. So there's many examples that there's a way of coming to this, and there's ways of working together. And I think it's been highlighted. We are at a time now so critical where things can really happen. We have the Declaration of United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples that have been ratified. It's been further supported by the Harper Trudeau government. We have the minister and her provincial policy statements now through her ministerial mandates telling her ministers to work with Aboriginal communities. There's a series of activities. Carolyn Bennett now just further acknowledged the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and most recently, I understand that there's a series of co-development tables now underway to start reversing some of these activities that happened under the Harper government that really began to threaten land and water for all of us. So what I want to say is allyship is this opportunity for everyone. One last thing I want to say for individuals, because this is all grandiose, and you come back and say, what do I do? A couple of things, support. Any opportunity you get to support. I'm working with a group to save our water, to stop Nestle from coming in and depleting the watershed. And I'd say to them, when you sit at the table, if they're not talking to us, maybe you could say, you know what, you've got to consult with the Haudenosaunee. Have you consulted with the First Nations? Make sure that we advocate for one another. And the other thing I'd say is at an individual level, is being good stewards of the land at an individual, because that's the responsibilities we all committed to when we said we take care of it. So even by doing that, by taking care of the land, air, water, your plants, your animals, you're in fact then becoming an ally with the Indigenous people. So I think I've come over my time, but thank you.
So I've been asked today to provide a concrete example of allyship, and I know that a lot of activism has to do with events. So a lot of activism has to do with, public speaking and being able to put on events that get press and get noticed and that sort of thing. And recently, I'm a member of the Milloy Keynote. We hosted a benefit for Attawapiskat. And although that was not a climate justice issue, it was certainly a justice issue. And so I'd like to provide you some concrete ways that happened and how that came about. Was anyone in the room there on May the 10th at St. John's? Miigwech, thank you for that. And we are grateful the fire marshal didn't show. So how this started really was about a half a dozen angry women in a room on a Tuesday night. I don't know what happened at the drum circle that night, but there weren't very many of us there. And Attawapiskat was in the news, and it was in the heat of the crisis where a number of children had made a suicide pact together. And I don't think I've ever been that angry. And as mothers and grandmothers and aunties, we felt we had to do something. We had to do something. And we talked about it, and we're a drum group, we're an Indigenous and settler drum group, so the natural thing seemed to be a concert. And we're good at that, we've proven we're good at that. And we've done an annual concert for 4 years, the theme of which is bridging communities through song and attempting to introduce Indigenous peoples and settler peoples to each other. So we knew that was something, at least in theory, we could pull off. The other thing is, though, we knew it was going to be a short window because, the public has a limited attention span. That's the sad reality, right? And we had to pull this off before it vanished from the news. So I think we had about 2 weeks, right, Helen? So here was the crazy moment, is we went home and Kelly started to email everyone we knew, and I put my phone on the bedstand and it just pinged all night. And somehow by the morning, we had all our performers. So it didn't take long. And the only one that was a logistical issue was even Susan Aglukark. So Susan came and sang and spoke for free, and all of the performers performed for free. I mean, we pulled this off without overhead. So that, when we passed the baskets, all of that money went straight to the community. The lion's share of it through the Mennonite Central Committee. I don't know if there's anybody from MCC here today, but we should clap for them regardless. And one of the things that I had said to MCC, and I have apologized to them for what I have referred to as my level of persistence in arranging this, is I had them assure me that the programs that they had on the ground, the culture camps, the art supplies for the children and that sort of thing, I said, I need to know that you're in absolute consultation with that community. I have to know that you are working with the elders there, that you are working with the community there, that this is not we're going to come in and save you and convert the heathen, because we don't need saving, actually. We can do that ourselves. We need support. And they answered all the right questions, because I said at the end of the day, I have to be able to go back to the women in my drum circle and say, this is being done in a good way. And it was helpful then, again, to talk to Susan, who had just returned from Attawabascat and had seen those people on the ground and was able to say to me, yeah, you're going the right way. These are the right people. So this was the original thought, and Lisa, if you'd hit go. So these are some of the performers. And we were really worried that we were going to get through this slate in 2 hours. And it became a fantastic blend of Indigenous and settler performers. And John Milloy said earlier that I work at Waterloo Lutheran Seminary, which is true, because I have a wonderful, fabulous, messy life. I'm a woman of mixed heritage. I go to ceremony, and somewhere along the way, Jesus and I made friends. And the bottom picture is the seminary choir. And the top left is Okama. The top right over there is Sing Fires of Justice. That's John Samosi down here in the right, and that's Susan Iglukark in the middle. And here's the thing. This piece of the puzzle we could pull off. The next slide is the piece of the puzzle that we weren't so equipped to handle. And I work in a faith-based institution, and I can tell you that there was equal outrage and concern and desperation to do something from the faculty and staff and the congregations that surrounded me, but they waited. They waited to see what we were doing and how they could be supportive. So the infrastructure that we couldn't pull off as a drum group, we had the entertainers. All of a sudden, we had people to be at the door to collect the money. We had people to literally stand in the parking lot and arrange for parking. We had people who ushered. We had congregations who stepped up and started baking. So we had people who donated for a silent auction. We didn't know we were going to have a silent auction, and things just started to come. And those were the kinds of things that the churches slid underneath and did for us. They just started. And I'm going to give a shout out to some of them. St. Paul's Lutheran in Bridgeport, St. John's Waterloo, and the Third Space congregation at the Seminary really stepped up and provided the bulk of the support that we needed to pull the night off. And they just did that quietly in the background. And they did it without fanfare. And it was amazing. And then the gentleman in the top left corner there is Bishop Michael Price of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, the Eastern Synod. And he and I were emailing on, I think the weekend before the concert, we were emailing back and forth, and I was saying to him, I just have to tell you I love my Lutherans. You've been so kind, and I can't believe how everybody has stepped up, and it's just, I'm amazed, and I wanted to tell you. And he said back to me, it's amazing, I'm so glad you're doing this, and I'm going to be there that night, is there anything I can do? And I said, well, yes, I need an MC, thank you. So I roped them all in, right? If you're going to do it, go big or go home. So that's the church. As you can see, there were people in the aisles. It was really that crowded. And we'll just go to the last one. This is my favorite shot of the night because we had live streaming running that evening. The concert is still actually available online. And there was this great moment where we all turned around and waved at the cameras. I bawled 4 times that night. Yeah, so Susan makes me cry pretty much every time we're together. So Susan makes me cry, and twice I cried over money, which is not typical for me. But, I think when we started, Kelly and I had a couple of $1,000s in our head. Wouldn't it be nice if we could raise a couple of $1,000s to send that to Wapiskat? And I was very inelegantly holding my cell phone behind my drum, because during the whole course of, if any of you have ever raised, run events, that it just keeps coming, right? There are all these things in the background. So I'm inelegantly holding my cell phone in my hand behind my drum. And the first text that made me cry was from Sonny McGuire-Smith, who was working the silent auction with Al, to tell me that the silent auction had exceeded $2,800. So it was like, okay, so we haven't started counting the money yet, and we're past what we were hoping for. So I teared up for that. And somewhere mid-concert, the ladies upstairs who were trapped in the boardroom with the checks texted me to say we'd passed 13,000. So that was astounding. By the end of the night, we'd crossed the $20,000 line, and I felt... Thank you. It was astounding. And I felt a little bad for the guy from MCC who was hoping to go home at 10. And I looked at him and said, "Oh, get comfortable, sweetheart. There's still money all over the table." So it was astounding to hit 20,000. But because this is about allyship, there's something that happened in the course of the concert that, for me, really illustrated what real allyship is about. And this was one of the times I cried in the course of the concert. We had a moment where John Smosey on his own had got up to sing, and he was singing the Eagle Honor Song. And if you've ever planned an event or been involved in liturgy where there's something that happens that people don't know what to do, for the event planner, that could last 20 seconds, but it feels like 4 hours, right? You can feel the tension in the room where we hadn't planned for this, we don't know what to do. And we had that moment when John started to sing. And so what happened is every Indigenous person in the church understood that they should stand. And they stood. And there was this tension, and I felt like I could feel, because this is a church full of people who want to help, right? This is a church full of people who are well-intentioned, who want to be there, who want to be supportive. And I could almost feel, especially because I had Inshallah, I was up in the sanctuary with the bishop and Susan beside me, and the Inshallah choir, the seminary choir, and the Sing Fires choirs were up there with us. And I could feel the tension of them wondering, do we stand or not stand? Is it more respectful? What do we do here? And so in that moment of tension, as I was standing, I put my hand down toward the bishop who was beside me, and he took my hand and he stood up. And when he stood up, Inshallah went up and the rest of the congregation went up, and we were all on our feet. And the piece of that for me, made me cry is I thought, liturgically speaking, the most powerful man in the building is standing beside me. He waited to see what I would do. So he waited to be invited. He waited to be invited into that. And he didn't presume that he should be the person who was leading in that moment. He waited for me to lead. And the reason that we could do that, and the reason that we could do that silently, is because he and I have a relationship. And we don't just have a relationship because of where I work. We have a relationship because he's taken the time to get to know me, to get to know the drum group, to engage with us. And to engage with us in a respectful way. We've done a lot of events with Lutheran congregations and with the Eastern Synod. And when you actually take the time to build those relationships, then you come to understand how to support each other. And so that was, for us, the most important thing is, we walked We walked out of there that night with many, many, many gifts. And the money was just one of them. I'll choose which for that.
So yeah, Dorinda has shared our story about the benefit concert for Attawapiskat. And when we were there at that event, you know, we picked Attawapiskat because it is in the news. It's been in the news 6 times for a state of crisis since 2006. But there are actually, I don't know if you knew this, but there are 27 First Nations communities alone in Ontario that are in active state of crises. And so, you know, part of what we were doing at that concert is raising awareness about the youth. You know, the youth are signaling a deeper issue. Not only that, they are just coming into their life when life should be grand and great and beautiful, and they're thinking about killing themselves. And nobody should ever be in that position. And that's unfortunately the state in many First Nations communities. When you think about the incredible poverty, why would any human being really, anywhere in the world, but Canada enjoys a standard of living anywhere from the 3rd to the 5th, so they rank that high around the world in terms of standard of living. But First Nations communities often rank around the 63rd. And that's very poverty-stricken, very low quality of living, and nobody should have to have that. So it was so many feelings that brought that this benefit concert together, and the spirit in the room. That picture kind of felt it, and anyone who was there, you know, I've spoke to so many people how the spirit is still resonating with them. You know, when I think of allyship, it's not a given. Just because you want it doesn't mean you can have it. You know, it's a settler thing to maybe, when we have an expectation of what we want, we think we can get it. And it may be possible, but it's only possible with hard work. And a whole lot of personal self-reflection and wondering, why do you want to be an ally? What is in it for you? And I think we have to ask those important questions. I also think that, and it's been mentioned already in other talks this morning, but relationship is key. Without a relationship, allyship is empty. You can't just show up at an event and think that there's going to be a help and then the allyship is now formed. And in fact, you know, what helped our Attawapiskat concert come together so well is that we've been building relationships with the Lutheran churches for 3 to 4 years. And so we have sat with them around a table, we've ate with them, we've sang with them, we've prayed with them, and we've cried together, we've joked together, and we asked those uncomfortable questions like, I'm sorry this is such a silly question, but I don't know. And so we break those barriers. And I think it's hard. I think it's really hard for people to ask a question. Settler peoples are so uncomfortable about asking something for fear they're going to look ridiculous, stupid, or whatever. And it's a little easier to ask it if we have a connection to the people, that we can just sit and have a coffee. And so when you did that, what was that about? And I don't know if we would ask those kinds of questions unless we had the relationship. So really, and the relationship that was building, as Dorinda was saying, is that they were waiting. They were waiting to see what was needed and waiting to be asked in some cases. And where they felt they could slip in because they knew that there was a gap there and that we were looking for, okay, now how are we going to solve that one? And so there was a lot of, you know, the nonverbals. We were reading each other. And and that when Dorinda talked about, you know, reaching down and grabbing the bishop's hand, there was an unspoken message that both of them understood what was needed in that very moment. And I don't think that can come without time of building those relationships. In different discussions and readings that I've done, I'm concerned about reconciliation. I do worry, as Elder Myeengun had talked about, about our future generations, about the young people, the little children growing up, and what will their futures look like. I also feel it's my obligation. I'm Indigenous, and I'm Sami, and I'm totally settler, because my ancestors came from Europe. The Indigenous Sami people had residential schools, and they had their cultures taken away from them too. But I'm dislocated. I guess my family didn't teach me those things growing up, so I've learned so much as an adult, and have reached to the local Indigenous community here to help find a sense of home away from my own people. But I have to look at the fact that I have that settler heritage, and I have to know my roots and where I come from. I really believe that for reconciliation, there is nothing short of the land settlements being dealt with. In essence, the land has to be returned. Not that we're going to suddenly give up Waterloo and the cities and where we live, but all of those outstanding land agreements and the treaty agreements that have not been honored, that there has to be conclusions to those. I was driving through Leamington area, and I saw a sign in the country, and what seemed like a few miles of land, and it said the future site of a particular First Nation. So I thought, there must be a land claim settlement that has happened. Cities have land that's vacant. Cities own land. The federal government has crown land. There's so many ways that the land that is outstanding could be worked with and resolved. Anything we do short of that is little fixes. And I don't mean to offend, but it's a settler way to want to fix a problem and move on to something else. Reconciliation is not something we can move on from. And in fact, I think reconciliation is about creating something really different than we have known. We all come from, if you think about it, Aboriginal roots. And because our histories as settler and Indigenous peoples, we're here because of the Aboriginal people and what they have provided for us. And we're here because of the history of colonization, assimilation. We're here and have the privileges that we have in society because of what Aboriginal people don't have. So there's a whole lot of room for allyship, but it does take a lot of time. When you go into an allyship relationship, it's kind of mimicking a little microcosm of colonization. So the colonial relationship is coming into when you sit around the table, settler and Indigenous people, that colonial relationship is coming right in the room with you. And so you have to debunk all that and work through all that messy pieces. We come in with our assumptions, and we don't even think we're making assumptions. We're just living our lives. And so we actually have to, stop and think about. And Indigenous people have to be brave too to say when they've been offended. When something has happened and a transgression has happened, we have to speak to it, or maybe settler peoples keep making the same mistakes with good intentions. I believe allies want to help and they have good intentions, but they may not know when they've offended, when they've done something that they just walked over the Indigenous person. And so we have to have that dialogue, but it takes hard work. It means sticking with it. It means maybe putting aside ego and having the humility, courage, respect to be able to listen to the feedback and to see how to do it different. And I think that takes bravery. of a person who can sit there and take some of the feedback and the correction. But that's how relationships have come about. There's been tight spots and sore spots and things that we had to work through with the Lutheran churches over the years, but they kept on coming back, and we kept on staying in there to help them with that understanding. And so those presumptions, or who's going to take leadership, or when to jump in and when to just listen. I guess one of the things I've learned over the years is from elders is listen or observe, listen, and listen again. Because maybe in the end we don't even have to jump in. And so that standing back and seeing what's happening and what is needed. So I've alluded to that there's a lot of pain. There is a lot of pain in allyship. And I think actually that's a teacher. If we're comfortable in all that we're doing, then I don't know if the learning is taking place, because it means you're coming from a familiar place of how you know how to do things. But when we feel unsettled, when we've just been hurt by something that someone said, there's a teacher in that moment. And it's for us to stop and listen to what is that teaching moment, what is that sharing with about ourselves, and that could be incredible learning and transformation. And I think, when I bounce back to reconciliation, reconciliation does mean us all having to give up something. It means all of us have to give up our comfortable spots and to shift into a new frame of being, of thinking, of interacting with Indigenous peoples. And so I guess that's kind of where I want to leave that this allyship is a process. It's ongoing. It's not done today. It's not done tomorrow. And it's not done next year. Reconciliation, I think, is our lifetime and beyond for the next generation. And so I guess the question is are we in this for the long haul? It was said earlier that we have to act, and the time is here. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People that came out in 1996. 20 years later, we have the TRC final report. There's so much that's similar in both of those reports, and we have to create that change now for the next generation. Thank you.
I'm going to move over here so you can see me. Onas, sego wakatuilado de kajunko as las lashingat waganaga ni ganyanga hagani as wagan wagidalo nene abuego ne la diontas koi la ne hanofa dahno ne abuego ongwe homo nene ansa sa dahne ate kolat ne yama I was asked to be here some time ago before, but I'm a farmer. We call it a meaning old-time farmer of my people. And I've been the last 3 weeks in the field. So I didn't really think I would have the time, but I'm pretty happy and proud of myself because pretty much yesterday I finished planting. And the reason I know that I finished planting is because what we call the Seven Sisters Star Constellation has moved out of its place. So we're not to be planting anymore. Right? To do some remediation work, but that in our culture and our way of being, we understand when it is we are to plant. Planting is a woman's time, and so we pay very close attention to the Seven Sisters constellation as to when we do certain things. The next constellation that our mind will be turned towards is the Seven Brothers, which will be your summer solstice. It's not a women's ceremony, it belongs to the men. It is the time when the men will gather to do their politics and things like that. And it's a different constellation. It's the male reciprocal of the female seven stars. So in our culture we learn and we watch these things and the movement of them. Okay? Right now, because it's very important for us in the things that we do as we go along. Okay, so I introduced myself. My name is Terrylynn Brant. As I said, I live in Anishnawbe, which is on the Six Nations territory. I am Mohawk Turtle Clan. Gchi-Nbi is my family lineage. I'm a farmer, a seakeeper, and Gchi-Nbi, so I'm just really happy to be able to stand up actually straight today. It's been a week. I had to finish off yesterday with 200 strawberry plants to be put in yesterday. So I can't believe that I'm standing straight. Anyways, one of the things I wanted to do was, I brought my basket, you see there, and I want to acknowledge the people in the community, or in the audience there. Raise your hand if you brought something other than a paper cup to bring your drinks in. You took the step to make a change, okay? Very simple step, isn't it? How hard is it to bring your own? It's not difficult. And it's kind of been a thing lately that, the media overuse, recycle, and all that kind of stuff. But the reason I brought my basket and sit down at the table is we have what we call longhouse baskets, right? And you'll see when we go to our longhouses, which, by the way, there are physical buildings that we gather at to stay out of the rain, but our longhouse has no walls. It's the sky above us, right? From the east to the west, right? We consider the entire territory our longhouse, our place where we live, our place where we practice our rituals, our place where we share, and we do all of our ceremonial things. It doesn't have to be a place, a physical building. In fact, when we did that and created that physical building, that's when I think we started to lose our relationship with Yetinista Almoncha, our Mother the Earth. And I think if you would think back in your relationships, in your times, it's probably that from your ancestral lineage, some of the times when your people started to lose their relationship with the land that they walked upon. It's like even looking in this room, at the pictures on the wall. What do we honor? They're beautiful pictures and everything, but they're buildings. They're people. Is that significant to us? So sometimes we've got to rethink about what it is that is significant to us. In my basket, it's crazy, but when we go to anything, any function, we carry our little longhouse baskets. There's nothing too earth-shattering in there. There's a cup in there, and a bowl, and a spoon, right, in case I get invited to eat. Right? Take care of that. My own honey's in there because I'm diabetic and I can't eat I can't eat white sugar, so I use my own honey. I'm a beekeeper. There's my sacred tobacco in there in case somebody happens to have need of that, or I'm invited to put mine in. So in my basket, there's a lot of things, and what I consider the things of my culture. My culture's in that basket. And you'll notice that my culture, my basket, it's pretty deep. Because I believe that they go way down within our souls, within our spirits, within our minds. These things, they enter and they go way in. But there's some walls on it. There's some sides to it. So it has limits. Right? And by limits, I mean there's some places and times where you're going to be invited to it. There's going to be some places and times where you're not invited. And that's one of the harsh realities, I guess they say, of allyship. As a traditional person in the community, as I say, as a seed keeper, meaning I carry the seeds of my people from time immemorial. I still have the corn seeds, the tobacco seeds, the things that my ancestors brought when we immigrated from the Mohawk Valley to the Grand River Valley. They've been in my family since that time. And I hope and work every day to make sure that they will continue to the next generation. Because we understand when our people can stop eating the foods of their ancestors, that they will change their DNA. They will not be Haudenosaunee people anymore. You only be Haudenosaunee people when you practice, when you live in the land of the Haudenosaunee people, when you speak their language, when you understand and you do their ceremonies, when you eat their food, when you have relationships in their way, then we consider you Haudenosaunee. That's the way it is. That's the way we do it. We invite all kinds of people in to join us, but sometimes for fear, unfortunately, we've asked you not to join us because we know we have had to go underground. And that's what this society has put on us. So unfortunately, while I really respect and I was just very happy to see your Prime Minister elected, just a young, mannerly, nice guy, you know, his mom would be proud of him, you know what I mean? Because if I was wanting a representative, I look at the old chiefs that represent me. I attend Confederacy Council and have been for over 25 years. And when I stand there and I look at those chiefs and I listen to their wise words and I watch their protocol and I watch them stand, never in anger, never with a harsh voice, but very mannerly with a lot of pomp and ceremony and tradition. I'm honored by that. And just that being or that way of doing makes us a proud people, makes us a strong people. So I commend you on selecting someone that's at least you're proud to say, hey, that guy's my Prime Minister, you know? I think that's really nice. I will wait to watch to see how it is that he does things. Because just because he's adopted the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous People, I can't see him putting it in place. But I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. I'll watch. I don't see it happening. Does that bother me? No, it doesn't bother me. Because I want to stand here in front of you for you to understand and know. There are parts of our communities, our traditional communities more so, that do not see themselves as part of Canada. I'm not a Canadian. I am not your First Nations. Right? I'm a Haudenosaunee. Right? I am just an Oklahoma person of this land, with a big long line of ancestors standing behind me. I don't know if you can see them or feel them, but they come into the room when I come in. And I ask them all the time to come and help me, support me, stand with me. And I'm sure you do have something similar. But in our culture, we don't see anything different. There's nothing different between their life, their realm, and ours today. We draw upon their strength to take us into the future. And that's one of the things that we ask people to be cognizant of, to be thinking of. So when we kindly ask you not to join, not trying to be mean, we wanted our ancestors to come to the door today. And sometimes that's all simply as it is. So as I said, my basket is full and there are walls on it. So sometimes, as your basket, we're just asking for that same type of respect. What we take as a Haudenosaunee people, we have our traditional government, we also have our elected government. Our elected government is doing the best it can with what little resources it has. It's trying to fight things that nobody should have, you shouldn't have to be fighting for clean water. Right? You just shouldn't have to be. It's just the way life is. But they're doing that best they can. The Conservative government made a First Nations Water Act that will literally tell them to make sure they have clean water in their community, but will not give them the means to do so. And by the means to do so, I mean the money. The Haudenosaunee people for many eons have lived here. Our land leases have gone up, and they have not been paid. Well, they were paid for. The Mennonite people, I heard about some. Where's this Mennonite? Is somebody here in the Mennonite community? No. I'd like to talk with you. Because they come to our traditional chiefs, and they were there a few years ago. And they always bring in blankets and quilts. They're beautiful, but they bring them as a gift. And they brought us some recently, and they reminded us of a story, because apparently they were putting up a building here somewhere. And in the building they wanted to put, I believe it was in stained glass, depict a certain relationship with the Haudenosaunee people. And they reminded us of the story of the time when they first settled here in Grand River Territory, and they were leasing the land from us. And they would come every year to pay their lease in crops, because they were farming people as well. And one year they came, they had very little in their wagons. It was a very bad year for the crops. The crops were failing. So they appeared to our chiefs and they said, well, here's our payment. And our chiefs knew, because we also had a bad year. And so the chiefs asked them, what is it? How are you going to survive if you're giving us all of your crops? And as being dutiful people, commodity-based people, they say, well, we have to pay for what it is that we have. And our chiefs said, no, just take your food, take that back, because your people have to survive too. So our chiefs refused the payment that year. And this was one of the stories that they came and told us that they wanted to depict. A story maybe that we had forgotten, but that little tiny group of people, they remembered it for years. You know? I very jokingly said, so, like, are you going to pay up now? Anyways, so there was that relationship right from the time when the settlers first come here with our people, Haudenosaunee people. And it's really important for us to remember those things, because the Haudenosaunee people are owed about $800 billion from the government of Canada in land leases and land thefts. Basically, guys like Jarvis and Simcoe, yeah, they were nice big name people, but the reality is they stole a lot of money. Our elected band council has been fighting for an accounting of those dollars, and that's the estimated value. The monies, Indian lands and reserves and trusts that are held by the government of Canada, they're all there, they have the paperwork on it. But they like to tell Canadian citizens, you know, we're going to use your tax dollars and we're going to, you know, we have to fund these Native people, and people are saying, why am I giving those Native people stuff again? Well, the reality is, you're not. You haven't paid your bill. So that's something that I want to set the record straight on. The government of Canada gives our people nothing. They're only giving us what they owe, and they're not even going to make a drop in the bucket, because that bill was huge. And this all started back at the times of land leases, back when we first started to settle among our. McGill University was built with our money. Osgood Hall was built with our money. The Queen Elizabeth Way was built with our money. Brock's Monument was built with our money. And the government of Canada, that was in its infancy, had nothing. They didn't have any money where their own people wouldn't keep their money in Canada. They used to invest in the United States, which I learned from historians, you know. So that's the way the government started, and now it's payback time, right? And right now, am I worried about payback? Not really, no. But I am worried about freedom. I'm worried about my freedom and the freedom of my grandchildren to be able to continue to speak their language, to be able to continue in the way of their ancestors. Because regardless of whether we're here or not, we will continue to haunt you. Sorry, that's what happens. And the way that we haunt you is within the way that the earth speaks back to you. People are saying there is climate change here. We understand that the earth from time immemorial has undergone its own renewal. Right? Everything. Snake sheds its skin. Right? Animals drop their shells, their fur. Everything rejuvenates, even the human. We get new skin cells every 7 years. Thank goodness the earth waits a little longer. Or we have, for those ice ages, right? For those catastrophic climactic events. So thank goodness that she waits. And in her waiting, right, we're going to maybe be in the way. Sometimes. Each time that she goes in and rejuvenates herself, they say our spirits go into the earth for protection, into her womb. That's the legends that we live with. And those are the stories that we pass to our children in an oral sense of the way. So when we have that basket there and all of our things are in it, our languages, our ways, our things that we do, okay, it has an open top for those things to constantly be refreshed, so that you can keep putting things back in by redoing them over and over again. We have a belief that the earth will only exist as long as we continue to do our ceremonies that honor her. That's what we believe. We believe that somewhere Lisa, the one who made my body, came and fell upon this earth, and our first mother created the earth. We believe that. We don't need science to tell us to prove it. And some people may look at that as something silly, but I know some of you people are very vested in believing your story of creation. And when things are in your heart and you're raised and you're in your bones of your ancestors, they're there for a reason. So I ask you, as we say, people, I asked my uncle one time what it is or how it is we're to do things. And we were standing there, I asked him, what is, because I am a teacher, I asked him what he thought was the most important thing to teach our children. And we were happy to be standing at the window, and his chickens were out there, right? And there was a fox in the yard. He says, watch him. He says, now normally that fox is not supposed to be there. He says, you won't just watch him for a minute. So I watched them, and they kind of walked by each other, didn't bother each other, for whatever reason. They knew how to get along, right? Maybe that fox ate someplace else, I don't know, but for whatever reason they got along. And he told me that's the best thing to teach your people, your children. Teach them to get along. So that's what I encourage everybody in allyship or in those kind of relationships. Not just getting along with First Nations, but getting along. Is there somebody in your family you don't talk to? Somebody in the church you don't talk to? You know, get along. The more we get along, the better we'll all be. There's only so much space, right? And hopefully in a good way that we'll share that space, right? So Nyawagoa, and again, thank you to the people that brought their longhouse basket. Yeah.
Even if you don't know any, you still live in your territory. So I just kind of think even your local schools, and it's your responsibility to understand and know who traditional territory it was and who is the closest First Nation around that today. And then the story is, well, what happened to those guys? You know what I mean? So I think there's certain responsibilities to understand legally, because in the courts and some of the treaty stuff today, it will affect you, right? Because you did have a treaty, you may have broken your side, but we're sitting, you know, some of the nations are still working to have those put back in place. So I think that you still have a responsibility to understand. And once you figure out who it is, then there's the next questions of, oh, I wonder what their cultures are like, and all those other kinds of things.
Yeah, go to powwows, go to youth and elder gatherings. We can find Indigenous people. We're the fastest growing population in Canada, so you're going to find us more and more.
And I just wanted to say, it is your job to seek people out. I mean, I'm not from this territory either. I moved here, to the map many years ago to go to school. And my family is from Eastern Ontario, Golden Lake, and Gchi-Nbi Mohawk territory. So this was not my territory either. So I had to make connections with the community here. And so, you know, if you're displaced and you're coming to make a life in a community, it's your responsibility to make connections.
And just another thing, we're all here today, so maybe get some contacts before you leave today. Maybe we don't know the people in your area, but we'll probably know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody.
You're gonna mess up. Let's please accept that and go on. You know, in a relationship this strained and this awkward over this length of time, there's no way into it without making a misstep. It's not going to happen. Mostly because we're all human beings and we're all learning together. And that shouldn't be a barrier. It shouldn't be a barrier. And there are mistakes between people all the time. And actual relationships, real relationships take work. So if you're invested in a relationship, you have to acknowledge that it's going to take a while and it's going to take work. And just don't let the fear stop you.
I'm reminded of this because Myeengun and I went to New Orleans together for 10 days, and it was an experience. So I need you to repeat after me. Haudenosaunee. Muskeguma. Anishnawbe. There's only three, Asanigo. There's only three of them. Is the major First Nations in Ontario, right? Or what you would call the people of the Longhouse, right? The Six Nations people, the Ojibwe people, and the Cree. We all have our basic protocols. Every time Myeengun stands up, I sit down. When I stand, he sits. So we do things directly opposite. When he goes this way, I go the other way. He's the sun person, I'm a moon person, okay? So understanding the fact that, first of all, get your heads around Anishnawbe, Myeengun, and Haudenosaunee, there's 3 of them. Try to find out their basic protocol, which means are they sun, are they moon, do they go left, or they go right? You know, because when he's doing it, oh man, hang on, that's a dead way, right? I'm sort of trying to, you know? So that's just the way it is. But it's like there's only 3. You know, yeah, they're all a little broke down into all little parts and pieces, but there's only 3. So take time to just get your head around the basic 3. There's combinations and such, but that's just the way it is. Yeah.
As soon as you sit down, I'm going to stand up.
But see, when you our people wouldn't stand, right? It's just that's the opposite, because we believe that all your minds have to gather to mine, so your energy comes here. As long as at the same level, it's not hitting it. So they're just differences there.
Hold this, Hold this. You sit down. This is, for the differences that we have in teachings, we get along pretty darn good. And I think this, we spent, like Terrylynn said, we went down to New Orleans and we went down with a whole bunch of people, and just me and Terrylynn came back in an RV together, for a whole day, being together in a van. We got along pretty good, but we had to refer to our relationship. So communication is the key, We can have differences of opinions, different ways, but we can still get along. And this belt here talks about the Anishnawbe and the Haudenosaunee and the road of peace between our nations. So this is what we're building on right now. Just in the territory that we're in right now, it's comprised of many of the different nations that we talked about. But we have to have this understanding together. And as the question is, regardless of what we don't understand, we can still get along and we can still ask questions and make it work. And I think that's all we need to do.
I would say in a nutshell, the easiest way is stand behind us, not in front.
I was just thinking, I think part of that is as well is to truly educate yourself on the community, the culture, the people, the history, and also find alliances within your geographic area. I mean, that's the work that I do in water and resources. That's the key often. Just don't have to be in the community constantly working with the community, but an advocate for what the communities are doing. And you can do that through your political leadership, through your local groups, but really becoming educated and knowing. That's half the battle often. And also, just to step back on the last question, I also think as Indigenous people, we have a bit of a responsibility to help make those conversations flow. And I say that with the chiefs and we do negotiations, and when we're at the table with, for example, the city to say, how do we work together? There's only so much that the settlers can do, and then it comes back to us saying we need to do some things here too. So I always take that as, I work with a few people that are very helpful usually, and it's so nice because even as someone who's evolving and learning in my own culture and being, and to be able to ask those questions. So I'm an advocate of education and making yourself knowledgeable so that you can make informed decisions and knowing how to help when we ally on environmental decisions and ecological decisions, that we stand together and maybe not just trying to be help the First Nations, so to speak, or the Indigenous people, but work together for something that's common for all of us.
I agree with what's been said. Also, the education is a big piece, and I think sometimes, well, actually a lot of times, maybe settler peoples rely on Indigenous peoples to teach them, and that can be taxing when it happens over and over. So probably the starting point is to just learn, educate yourself, going to forums like such as this, and then stepping into those spaces where there are Indigenous peoples and hearing them. And I think listening, the speaker spoke about when she was listening, and I think that's such a good teaching as opposed to coming in and even giving your thoughts, maybe just listening and hearing the climate of the discussion before feeling like you need to step in.
Another way is tire government. You don't want tar sands oil running through your territory.
When we keep talking about our responsibility, just so you know, when our children are first born, okay, they're given to the uncles, to their uncle, because the uncle is responsible for the spiritual guidance of a child. He makes the first speech to the child, okay? In that speech, he tells that child, first of all, you're human, okay? So that's number one. Remember, you're human, right? And he tells that child, this family's been waiting for you, they've been longing for you, they're so happy that you're here. And he identifies that family in terms of its clan or its lineage, okay? So with that, there are certain responsibilities that come with being that certain clan or lineage. But the other thing that he tells me, he reminds that child, you have a responsibility, and your basic responsibility in life is listen to your mother. Your very first teaching that you're given as an infant, like we're talking seconds old, it's a speech that's given to a baby when it's first born. Listen to your mother, and then listen to your grandmother. Now, we sit there and we because we're so compartmentalized in our thinking, we think that's just mom, okay? In other words, mind your mother, right? In our way of thinking, when we use that word, it's a very broad sense of the term, meaning your physical mother that birthed you, but for us in our languages, that's her sisters too, okay? So all your female relations, you should be paying heed to them. And when they talk about the grandmother, that next generation back, be paying heed to them. But the reality is that your mother represents the earth. So listen to the earth, right? That grandmother represents the sky world. She's a controller there. So there's two places that you also have to pay heed to, okay? So in listening to those, right, everybody's heart, it doesn't take rocket scientists, as they say, to look and say, that's not right. Okay, I know that's not right. When I was a young person, my uncle, I forget what we were talking about, but I said to him, tell me about the Great Law, which is the Gchi-Nbi, which is the teachings that we have. And he said to me, you don't have to go and hear it. You don't have to read about it. He says, the Creator birthed you with it. He says, it's up here. It's in your ability to think. It's in your ability to know the difference between right and wrong. Now, you know it's wrong to keep using a paper cup. So quit using that paper cup. You know it's wrong to turn the lights on, to leave them on when you're not in the room. Right? Well, I mean, at a certain level that we have to be, you know, it's time to toughen up a little bit. Let's get back to, you know, there are natural ways to cool your home, right? Leaving those windows and doors shut, you know, to a certain time. So going back to some of those simple ways of living that maybe your rural farming ancestors were going by, right? And I think that there are just so many obvious that we point out. How many times is it you told, and yet you don't do it, right? So heed those warnings, heed those things, those basic simple things every single day. Do you really need another sweater? You know, you got 30 in your cupboard, you know? So our desire to want has got to be curtailed somehow, right? We don't need, just because we're going back to school, kids, you don't need a whole new wardrobe, right? You know, so some of those basic things that everybody's culture was taught when they were younger. Cool, you know, I grew up with school clothes and play clothes. Who else did? You know? And yet we don't make our children adhere to that today. They just got clothes, right? You know, and so we do these things to our children. We're turning them into this society where we have to entertain them, and constantly we're wondering why they're going the path that they are. So to me, it's just follow the simple basic rules, and if we all do, we will all probably cut back 60% on everything. if we just follow those basics, and maybe that's enough. But be hard, be tough. Stand up and say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to leave that water running. I was at the doctor's the other day. I had to get a needle in my arm. And the intern came in and he turned the water on. He was doing something. And I'm sitting, it was just driving me nuts. Right? He washed his hands and he went out and did 3 other things and the water's still. And I said, you know the water's running. Yeah, I'm going to come back. And he never did go back to that water. He just went back and turned it off. And I said, you know, that's a big waste of water you just did there. And then also pointed out, you never recycled that container. And he's like looking, like, you know, like, who are you, lady? But if we don't take a beat up and say those things sometimes when we see the things that aren't right, it's just, I bet you that intern's turning the water off now. Right? So that's what I want to say to you, is remember those things that Ma taught you, you know, or Grandma, to save, to be frugal. Do those things, because in doing them, everybody does them, we're really going to be a lot better. You don't need 3 bathrooms in your house. Like, how much are you full of, right? No.
I'm a philosopher by training, and philosophers love to argue, which is why we're never invited to people's parties. So we make our own parties. So I'm going to make the following sort of argument in the next half an hour or so, that just people would not allow for, would not countenance the further expansion or development of the tar sands. Now, judging by some of what I've heard already today, I'm gonna assume that I'm preaching to the choir on that particular issue today. At least that is the case for the most part. So you might ask, well, what's the point of talking that way? I've been thinking and writing about climate change for the past 10 years or so. Much of my work has to do with trying to convince people who are skeptics of not just about climate change, but about very aggressive action to mitigate the impacts of climate change. If you want a symbol for all of this, Look behind me, straight in front of you. That's the shiny new behemoth called the Laurila School of Business and Economics that Laurie hasn't opened yet. I think it's scheduled to open in next January. That's a nice, and we are debating about climate change and talking about climate change in the shadow of that building. That is basically an homage to the economic status quo. And those are the people that I've been trying to convince for the last 10 years that we have to act very aggressively on climate change. And I'm going to give you a little taste of kind of like what I've been doing in that area. So I'm going to start by talking about the scope of the problem of climate change. I'm going to suggest to you after that that we need to talk in terms of the virtue of justice as a virtue. But we can. Justice is a funny thing, right? You can think of justice in terms of what are just outcomes, what are just rules, what are just institutions, and so on. I think of justice primarily as a virtue. It's a character, a personality. It's a personality trait that people either have or don't. And so I'm going to suggest that the best way to overcome the climate crisis is to think of ourselves as just people and what the implications of that thought are. Again, coming back to my friends at the Laurila School here, very few of them will deny that they are just people. Everybody likes to think of themselves as just people. Now, my claim is basically that you cannot be a just person and at the same time countenance the development of the tar sands. And that's where I part company with the people that I'm talking about here, right? They think that being a just person is compatible with the development of that particular resource, given the climate crisis. And so I'm going to present an argument here that attempts to challenge that particular perspective. So let's begin with the scope of the climate change problem. A lot of you will be aware of these particular numbers, right? Greenhouse gas concentrations are now above 4. Every time I give this talk, I have to change these numbers because it keeps going up and up and up. Above 400, I think the last time I checked the NASA website, it was 403. Parts per million. They were at about 280 parts per million prior to industrialization, and we're still adding, on average, 2 to 3 parts per million per year. So with business as usual, which it just is the 2 to 3 parts per million per year, temperatures are set to rise as high as 5 degrees Celsius this century, and that's relative to pre-industrial times, when they were about 280. So moral philosophy, or ethics as a discipline, as a philosophical discipline at least, gets going only if we can identify some harms that follow or are consequences of some of our actions or inactions, omissions if you like. So let me go next to what I think the most salient harms are from the kind of unconstrained emission of greenhouse gases. And these are harms that are likely to affect future generations mainly, although we can already start to see them affecting people of the present. Rising sea levels threaten up to 3 billion people living on coasts, and so we will likely see hundreds of millions of refugees. Severe droughts affecting many sub-Saharan African and Southeast Asian countries, which will result in dramatic crop failures and massive starvation, unless mitigating measures are adopted. Anywhere from 15 to 37% of non-human species become extinct. The continued retreat of glaciers, and we know that at least 1 billion people are facing freshwater scarcity on account of that particular phenomenon, right? Because they rely on meltwater. Increased incidences of deaths from heat waves, floods, storms, and fires. Increase in diarrheal diseases, vector-borne diseases, right? Mosquito-borne diseases, for example. Cardiorespiratory morbidity and mortality associated with ground-level ozone. This is just scratching the surface of the harms, right? It's not meant to be an exhaustive list by any means. We could compile and compound these harms. Now, I hope that I don't have to expound too much on how it is that these harms will affect the fundamental interests and the rights, if you like, of people that have to deal with them, people in the future. And as soon as we talk about actions of ours or inactions of ours that are affecting the fundamental interests of rights and rights of other peoples, we're in the territory of justice talk. Okay, that's what justice is essentially all about. So the question we need to face is, how did this come to pass? Now, I don't mean this as a question about the specific historical, political, and social events that caused us to be where we are, although I think that's a very interesting issue in itself. But about the underlying logic, if you like, the psychological logic that's underlying the situation we find ourselves in. What mode of thinking got us here? The answer to that is that, or at least the partial answer to that, or a beginning of the answer to that, is that we find ourselves in what political scientists and philosophers and game theorists call a huge collective action problem. Some of you have probably come across that concept, right? What is a collective action problem? Really, in theory, it's a very easy thing to understand, right? It's where the interests are what appears to be in the interests of an individual who's acting within a group, conflict with the interests of what's in the interest of that group, and so are actually not in the interest of the individual, him or herself. Okay, so what it looks like to be in my best interest, my economic, if you like, best interest in the short term, is in fact, given the fact that I'm operating in a group of other people who are thinking similar, is in fact not in my best interest. That's a collective action problem. It always produces, or almost always produces, results that are, as the economists say, suboptimal, right? Less good than what we could hope for. Okay, so we are in the midst of a huge collective action problem with climate change. Now, collective action problems come in all sorts of forms. One very famous form is the prisoner's dilemma. Some of you have probably heard of the prisoner's dilemma, right? Another very famous form of a collective action problem, or example of it, is more pertinent to the problem of climate change, and that's the problem of the tragedy of the commons. This is kind of a thought experiment. It's not meant to actually be an historical example of something that happened somewhere in our past, right? Some mythical time in our past. It's just a thought experiment meant to elucidate a concept. So the tragedy of the commons goes like this, right? Suppose you have a number of herdsmen farming a resource, or ranching a resource in this case, in common, right? The grasslands that are pictured here. Suppose that there are 10 of them, 10 herdsmen, and they've got 10 cows each. Now, each of those herdsmen must, let's suppose, make a decision on a monthly basis about whether or not he or she should add another cow. Okay, there are strong economic incentives for each of them to add another cow, because that's how you get your money, right? You let an extra cow graze the commons, and you fatten that cow up. You take it to market, and you make money from it. Okay, so from your own short-term vantage point, it looks good to add another cow at the economic margin, as the economists say. Now, remember, of your 10 herdsmen, every one of them is making this decision on, let's suppose, a monthly basis or a yearly basis or whatever it is, right? So it looks as though every one of them has an incentive to add a cow at each of those specified times. The result of which, of course, over the long run is the ruination of the commons. The grass gets eaten up by too many cows. Okay, so what looked to be in my short-term advantage turns out to be not in my advantage at all in the longer term, because I'm making a decision in the context of a group of other supposedly rational actors. That's the problem. Okay, now, why do I do it? Why does anybody do it? Because, well, I mean, there's just the straightforward reason that I want to get richer, right? But there's also the reason that I don't want to fall behind other people who will get richer than me if I don't act, right? So I think, okay, well, I won't add a cow, but those other guys are going to add a cow, and then they're going to have more money than me, and I'm going to look bad. Okay? So I don't want to be the sucker here. Now, another thought that might occur to the herdsman in this situation, and this is extremely relevant for our situation, is that although he recognizes, or she recognizes, that grazing that cow in the commons does cause some damage, the cost of that damage is spread over the 10 herdsmen, whereas the benefit of adding the extra cow, right, the material benefit accrues to that single farmer alone. So from the standpoint of strict cost-benefit analysis, it always looks like the best thing to do to add another cow. But of course, again, I reiterate, if all the herdsmen are making the same kind of calculation, they're all going to add a cow, the grass gets ruined. All right? That's the tragedy of the commons in its classic version. Now you might say, why the hell is he talking about this in a talk on climate change, right? Because it seems to me that the best way to think about the atmosphere is a kind of commons. And on its face, this looks like a good analogy, right? Because just as it is with the grass, we actually use the atmosphere for our economic benefit, right? Our industrial activity depends on the ability of the atmosphere to soak up our greenhouse gases. That's where our prosperity comes from, among other places. So now, here's how the thinking might go. Suppose you're a representative. Think now in terms of countries meeting each other, right? In, let's say, COP meetings, these things that happen every few years and produce no results. So let's suppose you're the representative of a country like Canada. You go to these meetings and everybody wants to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, or at least that's what they say and what they tell the press. And yet they get trapped into this tragedy of the commons thinking, right? They say, well, what happens if we in country X, Canada, mitigate our emissions over the next 5-year span or so? Well, we're going to take a bit of an economic hit, and if others don't do the same, then we're the suckers here. Right? And we don't want to be the suckers. So because we can't count on every other country doing its bit, we're not going to do our bit either. Okay, so we want to get ahead. There's the desire just to have that much more economic growth, but we also don't want to be the suckers. And, again, you don't have to be a climate change skeptic or denier to be engaged in this kind of thought process. You can say, yeah, there's some damage here, right, from climate change, but just as in the case with the grass, the costs of the damage are spread across the global community, whereas the benefits accrue to us alone. Again, from the standpoint of strict cost-benefit analysis, it looks like the rational thing to do is to keep on emitting, or even increase emissions for that matter, right? So that, I suggest, is the underlying logic of what's been going on in all those bloody meetings, and why, precisely why, nothing has been getting done. Okay, what we need is a different way of thinking about all of this. The defining feature of this type of collective action problem is that it is essentially reactive and calculative. Okay, so in other words, when I decide what I'm going to do, my decision is contingent on what I think other people in my group are going to do, however you define that group, right? The other 9 herdsmen or the other countries that are negotiating with me. My behavior is a reaction to what I think they're going to do. It's a calculation about what I think they're going to do, right? It's contingent on what I think they're going to do. Now, I suggest we need a different way of thinking about this, and I'm inspired in this by Dale Jameson, a philosopher at NYU, who has written this. I think it's the only way of getting out of the trap of bad logic that's involved in collective action problems, right? In other words, if you're a conscientious herdsman or negotiator at COP meetings, you go in thinking, I'm a just person, or we're just people, and this is what just people do, regardless of how others in this group act. Okay? You don't make your behavior contingent on what you think other people are going to do, right? Or what they actually do. Another way of saying this is that we really need to focus on the sorts of people that we want to be, rather than on outcomes and consequences and calculating about other people's behavior. So the virtues on this understanding, they give a certain amount of inflexibility to our behaviors. Now, that's kind of a counterintuitive thing to say these days, right? People think that inflexibility is a bit of a vice, and I understand why people say that, right? Nobody likes inflexible people, generally speaking. But the sort of inflexibility that I'm arguing in favor of here is a different sort, right? It's the kind of inflexibility that doesn't look to see what other people are doing before you decide what's right to do. Okay? That you come in knowing, in a sense, what's right already, and that knowledge is supplied by the virtues. Okay? Virtues like courage, temperance, wisdom, moderation, and so on are ways of seeing the world. They're ways of navigating the world. So if you're a courageous person, for example, you don't say, I'm going to do the courageous thing here, but only if a few other people step up first, right? Then I'll kind of like join in and join the courage game. You just do the courageous thing, right? Independently of what you think other people are going to do. So I'm up here to talk about justice, obviously. And so I want to talk about that particular virtue. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, talked about justice as a quality of the soul all the time. That's the way they understood it, is as a virtue. We don't really talk that way anymore because we think of justice, as I said before, in terms of just institutions and just rules and just procedures and so on. But the Greeks thought that justice was it was meaningful to talk about just people, right? People who had just characters or just dispositions, if you like. And so there's a little definition for you, which I've kind of distilled from Aristotle. A firm disposition to act in accordance with the principles of justice, and the italicized bit is important, right? Regardless of what other agents are doing. Of course, the next obvious question is what principles of justice should a just person adopt, right, or attempt to live by. So what I'm going to offer you here next is a principle of justice that is a bit vague or a bit abstract, but there's a purpose to that, right, or there's a reason for that, and it's that I want it to appeal to be as ecumenical as possible. I want it to appeal to as many people as possible, no matter what their religious, ethnic, or cultural backgrounds are, even if they're not religious at all, right? And I'm not a religious person, and I can actually buy into this principle. And so that's good, right? If everybody can buy into this principle, then we have at least a kind of a point of pivot on which to understand what our duties of justice in this case might actually be. So there's your principle of justice. We're not permitted to engage in actions that undermine the fundamental interests of future people, present people as well, right? But let's just focus on the interests of future people for now. Such interests as the rights to life, health, and security, unless doing so is necessary to protect more important goods or interests. Now, the italicized bit again is important, right? That's why it's italicized. That's actually what makes the principle as broad and as open as possible. Rights are very rarely in our culture absolute things, right? Somebody's right to do something is almost always counterbalanced by somebody else's right to do the opposite sort of thing. Most of us think that killing is absolutely wrong, but we usually say except in cases of self-defense or in cases of a just war or something like that, right? Take the case of yelling fire in a crowded theater, right? The right to free speech comes into conflict with other people's right to security, right? Very kind of mundane example. We always balance rights like that. So what we always need to ask in the face of when we're presented with principles like this is, first of all, do you agree with this principle? And secondly, in the case at hand, whatever it happens to be, do you think that there are some really significant rights and interests, right, or goods that override our duty not to violate the rights of some other people? Okay, so that I think is a fairly open, fairly broad moral principle. We could expand on it in various ways, but I'm going to stick with it for the purposes of this talk at least. So let's try and apply it to this particular case, right? And I'll come back to the principle at the end of this, right? Is Canada's oil ethical? I put the question this way because in our previous government's reign, there was a very conscious attempt to convince us that our oil is ethical, and that was what the main reason was given to us, at least, that we ought to be exploiting it in an unconstrained way. So let's first of all just look at the resource we're talking about here. It's very large, as you know. Up to 175 billion barrels of oil in the sand, which are proven reserves. Some people think that's even higher than that. Total resource could be as high as 3 trillion barrels. And it's been estimated that over 300 billion barrels may be ultimately recoverable, right? So the distinction here that's important is between the resource and the reserve, right? The reserve is what's recoverable with current technology and given current economic conditions and so on. And obviously that changes, right, over time. What was previously a resource can be a mere resource, can become a reserve if our technology, which wasn't developed yet, allows us now to access this. So think of horizontal drilling, for example, or the invention of fracking, right? I mean, 15 or 20 years ago, nobody had any idea that fracking could be done and could be brought to scale, right? And so all that shale oil was a mere resource at the time. It's now it's moved into the category of reserve. Okay, so the quantity of the reserve is obviously contingent on economics and technology. Okay, there's no way we can get all this oil out of the tar sands without damaging the climate further. So how do we approach this, right? I mean, that's a fairly substantive claim on my part, right? There are people who actually deny that, who think that we can get all this oil out, and that by itself, at least, won't do any further damage to the climate. And I'll come back to that particular claim as I move along here. So, I come back to my friends across the street. They might argue this way, right? That unconstrained development of the tar sands is justified in order to protect goods or interests of significant moral worth. I take it the reason I put the point that way is not because I've actually ever heard anybody from over there say that to me. But I'm trying to be charitable here. And I think that this also notice how this ties into the moral principle that I just enunciated, right? In other words, they're saying, we shouldn't undermine the vital interests of anybody, right? But in this case, even though we might be undermining the rights and interests of future people, it's justified. Because in doing so, we're protecting goods or interests of more significant worth. This is the only way that their argument can work, is if this is a sound claim. Okay, so I'm reconstructing the things they actually do say in a way that is as charitable as possible to them. All right. So of course, if this is the basic claim, we need to ask, well, what are these significant, or these goods or interests of significant moral worth? Right? Like, show me the money. What are the arguments? So, for the rest of my talk here, I just want to mention 3 arguments that are very often brought up in support of the claim that we ought to exploit this resource in an unconstrained fashion. Now, I'm not making these up out of the blue, right? These are arguments you hear in the media, and have heard in the media all the time. Okay? So, here's the first one. Security argument. The tar sands represent, and by the way, you can get all, if you want a particularly annoying example of all these arguments that work at once, read Ezra Levant's book called Ethical Oil. He has all of them, and they're all supported by equally bad arguments. So we might say this, right? And this has been said by Levant himself. The tar sands represents a secure source of oil in contrast to many of its global competitors, right? Not like that nasty Venezuelan oil. Extracting and selling this oil will thus enhance human security. Levant has actually used that particular phrase. So it ignores the profound security threats posed by climate change, of course, right? So to come back to today's theme, the economic security and cultural integrity of many First Nations communities will be undermined. In Naomi Klein's language, their lands will become big oil sacrifice zones, and already are becoming big oil sacrifice zones. Huge numbers of refugees may find themselves on Canada's shores. This will make the Syrian refugee crisis look puny by contrast, right, in terms of our ability to cope with that on a social and political level. Terrible regional wars, possibly between countries with nuclear weapons. For example, India and Pakistan could go to war over access to water as the Himalayan glaciers dry up. And again, that is not meant to be an exhaustive treatment of the security problems associated with climate change, right? So that argument doesn't work, right? You can't claim that our oil is making life more secure, okay? Either for us or for anybody else. So the argument from economic necessity. You hear this a lot too. Aggressive mitigation measures will destroy the Canadian economy. Maintaining the status quo is a necessity if we wish to avoid grave social dislocation, political upheaval, massive unemployment, all that sort of stuff. So here are some of the central flaws of the appeal to economic necessity. So the Stern Review, written by the British economist Sir Nicholas Stern, which has just been updated, by the way, he says we can devote 2% of global GDP now to mitigation in order to avoid paying 20% later. So that puts the economics of the thing into some perspective, right? It looks absurd to say that it's an economic necessity for us to exploit the tar sands in an unconstrained fashion, or more generally, exploit fossil fuels in an unconstrained fashion, right? That's the economically wise thing to do, if that's going to lead us to a path where we are devoting 20% of global GDP in 50 years or so to coping with climate catastrophe. And that is Stern's prediction, right? Whereas If very aggressive mitigation measures could be handled now with 2% of global GDP. Do the math, right? Secondly, appeals to necessity are, I say, often ideological. I think they're always ideological. I think there's very little necessity in the world, right? Metaphysically speaking. When I was researching my book, I did quite a bit of work on apologists for slavery in the South. And it is amazing how often so many of them said that the current system is necessary. We can't get away from this system, right? It would destroy this other way of life. And, that worked, right? But clearly that's what we mean by an ideological appeal. It's used to, what is ideology, right? Ideology is where a vested interest presents its point of view, right? The point of view that is advantageous to it, or the set of practices that are advantageous to it, as best for everybody, or as inescapable. That's ideology, right? You got it in the South with respect to slavery, and you're getting it now from big oil, okay, and their lackeys in the mass media. Finally, does fear of economic dislocation and all that sort of talk, right? This is tied to the previous point. Does all of that make or mask a refusal to tolerate any downward pressure on standards of living, right? In other words, it may be true, Stern says 2% of global GDP. That's a bit of a hit, right? That's a bit of a cost. Let's be honest about the fact that dealing with climate change aggressively might cost us something, right? Are we then saying, however implicitly, well, any cost is unacceptable, right? And so the alternative is a necessity, i.e. doing nothing. Okay, so I think that talking in terms of necessity simply masks a refusal for us to see any downward pressure on our current standards of living. President Bush said this with respect to the Kyoto Protocol, right? He said the American way of life is not up for negotiation. We will tolerate no downward pressure on our standard of living in order to live up to the claims of this particular protocol, and therefore we won't sign it. Okay? So I think that claims of necessity sometimes mask that refusal. Okay, final argument is my favorite. The only 2% argument. You probably come across this, right? You hear this all the time. Canada is responsible for just 2% of global emissions. So even with the tar sands running at full tilt, we're simply not a significant part of the problem. So nothing to worry about, right? So here I think our approach has to be kind of nuanced. Because that number is actually correct, right? It's true. There's a distinction in the literature between stock and flow. There's, first of all, the flow of greenhouse gases, which is how much we're sending up into the atmosphere at any given time, right? And that's what's being talked about here, right? We are our contribution to the total global flow of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is 2% of the total, right? On the other hand, there's the stock. And the stock is how much of the stuff is already up there. So what I suggest we do, whenever we hear this argument, what I suggest we do is we change the conversation. And we say, let's stop thinking in terms of flows and think in terms of the stock instead. Here's why. If you think of the stock of GHGs, you're led naturally to the idea of the thing that is holding the stock. That is to say, the container, which is in this case, the atmosphere. And you're led naturally from that thought to the idea that maybe that container has a limit, right? So immediately you get into a kind of mental frame that allows you to think in terms of limits, ceilings, budgets. Enough. Whereas if you stick with the flow mentality, you'll never come to that thought, right? Because all you're talking about is what's actually emitted and what your tiny percentage of that total is. That doesn't get you anywhere near the need to curb your emissions. And the people who make this argument realize that. That's why they make this argument. Okay, so now I'm suggesting you say, anybody starts talking about flows, say, shut up about flows, I want to talk about stocks. Okay? And then we have to talk about containers, then we have to talk about the finitude of our containers, and then we have to talk about the carbon budget. and how much of that oil is unburnable if we're going to avoid climate catastrophe, right? This is the next logical step in the thought process that I'm examining here. There's a lot of noise on this particular graph, but what we're interested in here is Canada in the kind of the upper left of the picture here, right? So this is how much oil, and by the way, this is reserves, not the resource, right? So this is the stuff that's economically and technologically accessible currently. And how much of these various forms of fossil fuels must be left in the ground. Canada, 75% of our oil reserves have to be left in the ground if we're to do our part at keeping global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius. Okay? That goal of keeping 75% of our oil in the ground is simply not compatible with saying, oh, well, it's only 2% of the flow, so it doesn't matter. We may as well triple production from the oil sands. Why not, right? It'll still be only maybe a little bit above 2%, but not much. So, with all that in mind, here's the central flaw of the argument, right? The only 2% argument. There are about 240 gigatons of carbon in the sands. These are reserves, okay? That represents 42% of the entire world carbon budget of 565 gigatons. 565 is what has been set to avoid catastrophic climate change, right? To avoid, I mean, this was all done when we thought 2 degrees was fine. Now we all think that 2 degrees is not good, right? We got to aim for something closer to 1.5. So that skews these numbers a little bit, right? But it makes the story even worse, even more dire. So let's just stick with the 2 degrees or slightly below 2 degrees target. Burning all of the oil in our reserves would mean that Canada, which has, I don't know when last I checked, less than 1% of the global population, 0.5% of the global population, and we get half the carbon budget. That sounds fair. I mean, I suggest that's on its face, that's a ludicrous claim. Okay? So as soon as we start talking about the stock, we got to talk about the container, then we got to talk about the budget, and as soon as we start talking about the budget, we have to talk about how you distribute what's left in the budget in an equitable fashion, and I suggest that the lion's share of that has to go to the developing world at this point, which means we can burn almost none of our oil. Almost none of it. Okay? The last thing we should be doing is building pipelines to, as our politicians love to put it, bring our oil to tidewater. Okay, so let me wrap up. Come back to the principle. I said I'd come back to this. We're not permitted to engage in actions that undermine the fundamental interests of future people, unless doing so is necessary to promote more important goods or interests. I suggested to you that the only way the advocate of business as usual could accept that principle and also argue for the expansion of the tar sands is on the basis of those 3 arguments that I just gave you. But I've also suggested that those arguments are lousy arguments, okay? And that person, therefore, does not have a leg to stand on. So, Canadian oil is not ethical. Unconstrained development of the tar sands is not morally permissible and cannot be rationally defended as a legitimate political goal. So to come back to the focus on the verses, just people would therefore exploit this resource no further. Thank you.
I greet you this afternoon as Gchi-Nbi. That is my given Gitsan name, which means sister of the East, and it was presented to me at a community gathering by hereditary chiefs and elders, including Ray Jones and Jim Angus, who are not only hereditary Gitsan chiefs, but leaders in the United Church of Canada. And I'm holding with me an eagle feather that was a gift from a beautiful soul named Lottie Mae Johnson, who's a Mi'kmaq woman, and who served on the Survivors Committee of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I name these dear ones as they represent so many others who I will not take the time to name, who have been good teachers to me, and for whom I am very grateful. So I name them at the outset to honor them. They have helped me to understand that we will not achieve climate justice or justice of any kind without mutual respect and mutual learning. This is the foundation of what we've been talking about today. It's been reinforced many times in many ways today. So I honor these courageous elders and others like them. Many of you here today from faith communities will bring your own stories of gratitude for generous Indigenous teachers and the grace with which they have received you and taught you. I'm going to tell some of my stories that are mine, not long, and those of my community, trusting that they are resonant with your experience in your faith community. It was almost 50, it was 46 years ago when Aboriginal elders and members of the United Church of Canada started to organize within the church and named themselves the National Native Council. Thanks to their courage, particularly that of Alberta Burke-Billy, they asked the church for an apology in 1985. The following summer, 40 years ago this August, the United Church responded with an apology. There are many good words in that apology, but let me say it was essentially an apology for trying to make you like us. And the apology was not accepted. This has turned out to be a great gift to the church. The apology was acknowledged because it takes more than words to complete an apology. So when the then All Native Circle Conference a couple of years ago formally responded, they in their wisdom said in part, "Our spiritual teachings and values have taught us to uphold the sacred fire, to be guardians of Mother Earth, and strive to maintain harmony and peaceful coexistence with all peoples. We only ask of you to respect our sacred fire, the creation, and to live in peaceful coexistence with us. Let us unite our hearts and minds in the wholeness of life that the Great Spirit has given us." I present this background because I, again, honor these elders, and if we are to have a just transition to a clean energy future in this country, we won't do it without uniting our hearts and minds in the wholeness of life that the Great Spirit has given us. So there are, among all the reasons, 3 reasons which I will quickly identify three aspects that I see of our role, and I will say our role as faith communities, people of faith. One aspect of our role is to listen to and take our lead from Indigenous communities. It was as a result of listening to and taking the lead of the BC Native Ministries Council that the United Church of Canada came to categorically reject the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline in 2012. It was because we allowed the Native Ministries Council, you understand. We stopped long enough to listen, and we took their lead. Frankly, at the time I was moderator and I wanted to rush in and say, the church condemns this. But fortunately, I took a moment and realized, I need to listen first and others need to take the lead. What would our apologies mean if we weren't prepared to publicly support the council's good arguments? And in a related move, you know, last year the United Church decided to divest our treasury of fossil fuel investments. A second aspect of our role as people of faith is to amplify Indigenous voices. Kiyojus, who is also known as Barbara Wilson, is a Haida elder. She and I were in the United Church delegation to the last International Climate Talks, COP21 in Paris. We were among those pressing Canada to ensure that the agreement include a commitment to human rights, a commitment to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights for all, including and explicitly the rights of Indigenous peoples. And Canada's negotiators, we saw them in turn pressing then the international community to include that in the agreement, that wording. Even though those words ended up in the preamble of the agreement rather than the operative part of it, our government in Canada can now be held accountable domestically for what they were prepared to argue internationally. So that's something that we then, as people of faith, are responsible to amplify back here and make sure that commitment is kept. You may also know that in Article 7 of the Paris Agreement, there is an inclusion that we need to be guided by traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples in addition to Western science. We might in this room say, in a kind of primary way, ahead of Western science. At any rate, it is in the agreement, and this dynamic interplay between ancient wisdom and new technology is part of the just transition, will be and is part of the just transition to a clean energy future, and it's something we have to keep raising our voices about. Kiyojus really was wonderful in Paris at lifting up all these local solutions and seeing people around the world. We were very active with the indigenous voices at Paris. Yes, I know that these climate talks have not always been successful, Byron. This one was different than ones that came before, and one of the moments that made it different was when Canada's Minister of the Environment and Climate Change said Canada is committed to a 1.5 degree, no more, increase in global temperatures above industrial levels. And we all went, what? And it was clear that her negotiators went, what? And that was just a moment of justice when she knew what the right thing to do was in order to give small island nations a fighting chance. And so it was a moment of not checking out to see what others might let you do or how they might get ahead of us. And now that means we, friends, are part of what it's going to take to keep that commitment. So a third and final aspect of our role is to be resilient and to support personal and communal resilience for the hard work of just transition. We as people of faith must deepen our relationships and build new ones and attend to spiritual health. Quoting again from the All Native Ministry Council, the All Native Circle Council, in their response to our first apology, we must unite our hearts and minds in the wholeness of life that is given to us by the Great Spirit. One quick example, my own congregation, for instance, decided that to be part of the response to the TRC's calls to action, we had to really get to know the land and the water in which we live and worship, as well as our Indigenous siblings. And we invited First Story to come and lead us in a walk along the Humber River watershed. It was fabulous. Phil Cote and John Johnson led us in a traditional understanding of where we were. We deepened our relationships. Phil and John said, well, we knew you were going to call. All of this is prophesied. We know you non-Indigenous people are going to call us. And we're glad to come and be together in this 8th sacred fire. As Kiyojus told Canada's negotiators in Paris, We are all in the same canoe, and we need to paddle together. Ultimately, the role of people of faith in faith communities is spiritual. It's about right relations with our Creator, with one another, and with the whole Earth community. Climate justice requires both humility and chutzpah, because none of us has all the answers. We need one another. We've been created this way. We have to be humble because I need to hear from you. And I need to bring my voice and need to encourage you to bring yours for the same reason. We're all in this together, and we need one another's help and perspective. Climate scientists have told me for years that they're counting on us because we bring a language of love. And it's a language that speaks to hearts. They know more than most that the language that speaks only to minds and to logic and to reason will never be enough. We need to bring our language of the heart if we are to find a place of unity where our hearts and minds are united in the wholeness of life that the Great Spirit has given us. We are doing that today. Gchi-Nbi.
Ani buju Lindsay Grey Anishnawbe and Anishnawbe and Haudenosaunee and Delaware and So I like to introduce myself in my language first, and then I go into translating it into English, because my teachings are that it's not only us in the room right now, we also have ancestors and we have other things with us that should be able to come and be in this discussion and hear and be acknowledged. So what I said was, hi, hello, my name is Lindsay Grey. I'm Anishnawbe, I'm from Anishnawbe, I am also Potawatomi, and I'm Delaware. I am from Anishnawbe, and if no one really knows where that is in this room, it is very southern, but it's also western Ontario. It's a border town, so we also have Michigan on the other side. That's where my Potawatomi comes from. And then it's also surrounded by Canada's 40% petrochemical industry. And so what that looks like is 63 refineries, facilities in the 25-kilometer radius of my community. And so that is a lot to put around a small community that is very, very tiny. It's only like 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers. So it's kind of small to have 63 facilities around my small community. And so what that does is it impacts our daily lives and the way that even we're born. And so what I mean by that is everything is polluted. The air is very smelly. If you've ever been to the area, it reeks of different things a lot of the times, because it's not just petroleum that's being made there, it's also byproducts as well. So we have things like, it may smell like plastic sometimes, we've had it smell like nail polish. The weirdest one I think is sulfur, because it smells like eggs, and so that always kind of messed with me while I was on the school bus going to and from to town, just smelling eggs, like either in the morning or when I'm heading back home, and not even knowing what that was, but just knowing that that was a familiar scent that we always had to drive through. Some of them are quite stinky, but that doesn't mean that when you can't smell anything, that's a good thing. We've had before where someone has been doing testing of the air and they thought they were going to get a blank sample somewhere, so they couldn't smell anything. And so they tested the air, and it turns out there was actually some pretty dangerous chemicals in that airspace. Another thing that's polluted is the ground. We cannot plant gardens. We've been told that some years. Some years that we can, some we can't, but a lot of the times when I bring medicines from home, Like cedar, I usually tell people that it's not something you can use as tea like it would usually, but it's still okay, I think, to burn. But that impacts our daily life as Anishnawbe people when you can't properly live off the land because the air smells weird, and that may mean chemicals, and that you can't use the medicines properly because we should be able to make cedar tea or even do cedar baths, but that's something that I try and stay away from. Another thing is the water is very polluted, and so this is a very big issue in my community. There is a creek that runs through the back of, like all the way across the reserve, and it's called Telford Creek. And so this water has had many different impacts on the community from industry dumping within it. And so the water is very polluted. We have signs up around it that say, do not touch the water. You could get a serious illness from it. That's not the correct wording, but it's basically what it says in a nutshell. So it was weird growing up and thinking I can't go touch the creek in my backyard when that was probably a normal thing for kids to do, is go play in the creek, go catch frogs. But I was very afraid to touch that water. We also have the St. Clair River, which is connected to the Great Lakes, which everyone here can probably tell is very important. But industry doesn't seem to respect it enough or to take care of it. So there's been some pretty large historical spills, and even to today there is really horrible spills where Dow actually closed down in 2009, but Dow is probably a name that some of you can recognize. So it closed down in 2009, but in the 1980s it spilled 11,000 liters of dry cleaning chemicals into the bottom of the St. Clair River. And so what that did was it mixed up with the sediment at the bottom of the river, so they have been historically releasing, and that's been impacting the water. So it turned into what now jokingly Sarnia calls the blob. But Anishnawbe kind of jokes about it too, because it was an old horror movie, if you guys have ever seen it. It's called The Blob, and it like eats people. Well, it's a little bit different in my community, where it's not only the 11,000 liters of dry cleaning chemicals that they spill, it's also mixing in and making, we don't even know what it contains anymore. But people will say now that, oh, it's been cleaned up, it's been cleaned up. But when a lot of local people know that it actually hasn't, because it's been coming up through a park that we now call Asbestos Park, where it used to be a salt mining facility but closed down. And so what they did was they buried, and the ground was very polluted as well. And so now it's coming up with asbestos, and 3 times the amount of lead that a human is supposed to be exposed to. So the blob has been coming up, like seeping up through the ground, and even like family members that I've had that have gone to gatherings in that park, like before they closed it, was saying that they stepped in what felt like gum. It was very sticky and slimy, and it was black. And realizing she stepped in the blob that was coming up through the ground, and I think it was called Red Fest at the time. But this is like a very normal story in Anishnawbe, but it can be shocking to other people to know how pollution really impacts our community. And so not only is the environment around us, it's also biologically impacting us. And so what that looks like is testing that we've had done has come up with people having mercury in their hair, as well as people have been found to have PCBs, which are now banned in Canada. It's in our blood systems. And so this also impacts the way we're even born. where there's 2 girls for every boy. Currently, that's the statistic of Anishnawbe, and a lot of people, community members that I've talked to, are worried that it's growing to 3 girls for every boy. And so that's a really huge impact to think of how pollution is even going within us. It's trespassing in us to eliminate even parts of our population. And so there's also there's a statistic of a 39% chance of having a miscarriage in Anishnawbe as well. So this is something that I like to talk about to people, because people really don't know what the cost of oil is. Whereas in my community, where it's being refined and produced and shipped out, because we're a very central location, this is why there's it's the best reason I can come up on why they put so many around our reserve. Not only that, but it's also still colonization happening, and it's also still a genocide where they put all these facilities within a small reserve. But that's not the only story that you will hear of our people being impacted by these, I don't even know what to call them, these projects like pipelines, like facilities, or even extracting, like mining and tar sands, where it's impacting the First Nation, or it's impacting the Indigenous communities. And so that is another form of trying to even feel like get rid of us. So this is the work I do. I like to talk about my community and bring it to people's issues, because we need to look at this as a multi-layered thing of not just it's black and white where tar sands are bad. It's impacting us as people, it's impacting so many different things, and it's affecting, and there's so many ways we can change, or how even change isn't happening yet, and how either like there's different routes, but people need to look at the facts and look at how it's impacting our Indigenous communities, and how people are very comfortably living with this, and how oil is being used every day and just being extracted and extracted and extracted, and looking at that versus how much do we have, how people are suffering from this. So I guess what I'm trying to say is to understand our stories as Indigenous people and how we're being impacted, and look towards how you're living and how you can go into your daily life, or start creating change around this. So another thing I wanted to bring up was I brought t-shirts to sell for a legal case where 3 land offenders in the community allegedly shut down Line 9 as well. It was in their own territory, for one. 2, they contacted Enbridge ahead of time, and Enbridge actually reportedly said in many articles that went out that day that they shut off the pipeline. So they need legal support, especially since it's one of them is from the territory and have every single right to shut down this pipeline that has been illegally put into the ground. Another thing we have in Anishnawbe that's coming up is a toxic tour, where we bring people into the community and we share experiences, and we show history, and we do a giant tour of Chemical Valley so that you can see and experience it for yourself. As well as we have the Anishnawbe water gathering, where we can actually talk about and have elders share on why water is sacred, because there's a huge disconnect with people on why water is sacred and why we need to protect it and why it's important. And we have these teachings, but youth need to be able to know that in order to go through with fighting these issues, because we need to know why it is sacred. I guess I don't want to take up too much time. Thank you.
my thesis is that those of us in faith communities have a very important role as activists, as allies, but we must take our lead from the Indigenous people. And there's multiple examples of where this is happening. This morning, Megan talked to us about the struggle of the Chippewas of the Thames around Line 9. And there are many allies with that struggle who are raising money, in fact, for the Supreme Court challenge. And that challenge is going to be important not just for that one particular struggle, because I'm going to give some examples of some other struggles against tar sands projects and pipelines that are going on right across this country, where Indigenous people have resorted to legal challenges, hoping that the government would fulfill its constitutional obligations. But it takes a long time to get these cases through the courts. And when they do reach the Supreme Court, as the Chippewa Challenge is going to do, it will set a very important precedent. So I hope we're all standing firmly behind that challenge and supporting it. So just quickly, what are some of the other tar sands pipelines? The names are familiar. Starting on the east, Energy East, going through to New Brunswick. Well, the Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba chiefs have all stood against this pipeline. And they're getting strong support in Ontario as well. And in New Brunswick, the Wollastog Grand Council is standing against it. And I'm happy to say that our Kairos committees in New Brunswick are firmly mobilizing against Energy East through their province as allies. Mardi talked about the Northern Gateway Pipeline, and it's very significant what she said about the United Church taking its lead from the Native Ministries Council. Again, an allyship, which was very important in what most of us think as a great victory. This is one case where we think the Prime Minister probably will have to keep his word about banning tankers offshore Northwest BC. But this would not have come about if it wasn't for the mobilization of Indigenous peoples throughout British Columbia in the Kchi-Nbi Alliance and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs all contributed to that mobilization. Right now in Vancouver, our Kairos folk are standing with the, I'm not going to pronounce it right now, the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, which is challenging the Trans Mountain pipeline, the terminal in Burnaby. And a few weeks ago, they took to the ocean in kayaks, calling themselves kayaktivists, which is a lovely word. And in a show of support that actually risked, it was a minor example of civil disobedience. They were willing to be arrested. Had there been a tanker coming into the terminal at that time, they could have been arrested. And I think sometimes, in certain circumstances, our allyship will call us to put our bodies on the line and maybe risk arrest in examples of civil disobedience. Yesterday, Kairos, we weighed in on another important struggle. It's not a bitumen pipeline per se, but it's one linked to energy policy. And that is the Site C Dam in northeast British Columbia, which again, the Treaty 8 people have been resisting for over 30 years. Right now, there are cases before the courts from the West Moberly and the Prophet River First Nations. But what's happening is the government of British Columbia is trying to push this project through, in the Premier's words, past the point of no return, so that by the time the courts pronounce, it will be seen as too late. And so anything we can do to delay that decision, to delay that project until the courts hear the just claims of the First Nations, I think is very important. To do this, our major strategy at the moment is aimed at the federal government. Because although the previous government under Prime Minister Harper did issue a permit for the Site C Dam. Other permits are still pending. The Minister of Fisheries and the Ministry of Transport, they have yet to issue permits. And so we've issued yesterday an open letter to the Prime Minister and the Premier saying, please do not issue these permits. Give the courts a chance to hear the First Nations claims. And in the letter, we simply cite the words of the Prime Minister. What he said in his letter to the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, Catherine McKenna, and I want to quote, "No relationship is more important to me and to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples. It is time for a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership." And the Prime Minister doesn't lose a chance to mention that his government now has endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and you all have on your tables copies of that. But as Terrylynn said this morning, the Prime Minister is not fulfilling this promise. And the primary example of this, for me right now, is his refusal to stop the Site C Dam, which is also, interestingly, you might think it's, a dam, it's going to be hydroelectric, it's going to be clean. Not really. Because when you analyze where the power from that dam will go, it will go to the liquefied natural gas processing terminals that they want to build. And when you go back upstream, where's that gas coming from? It's coming from Indigenous lands, through fracking, releasing immense amounts of methane, a greenhouse gas that's 85 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And so that project is also a climate project, even though they don't want to admit it. Okay, well, where's the Prime Minister getting his advice? This morning, Megan talked about the National Energy Board hearings. And this first slide I have is one set of advice being given to the Government of Canada. This is the NEB's projection of what our energy mix would look like in the year 2040 based on where we're starting from, which is right now the latest data from the year 2014. And the first thing you're going to say is, they look the same. And you're right. There's very little difference in these two pie charts. A little less coal, and that's because of Ontario shutting down the coal-fired generators. But look at the renewables. Hydro is the same percentage in 2040 as it was in 2014, 9.9%. And it actually shows for other renewables, for solar, for wind, for geothermal, a shrinkage down to 6.3 from 6.5%. How does the NEB come up with these figures? Well, it's their business as usual case. They accept that under current policies, maybe coal will shrink, but the renewables are not foreseen to grow. That's one set of advice being given to the Prime Minister. But there's another voice. Maybe some of you saw it in the news a couple weeks ago. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, under access to information, got this document called Canada in a Changing Global Energy Landscape. And it comes from a group I'd never heard of before in the federal bureaucracy, Policy Horizons Canada. So I asked David when he was in government, did he hear about it? David didn't. But God bless the CBC, because what this report says is exactly the opposite of what the NEB says about our future. It says literally, there's a new global energy ecosystem in which energy competition will be on technology and not resources in the ground. And these are actual quotes from the conclusions of the document. It says, it is increasingly plausible to foresee a future in which cheap renewable electricity becomes the world's primary power source, and fossil fuels are relegated to a minority status. Wow. This plausible future could seem to recommend against long-term investments in oil and gas production and infrastructure, as these are at high risk of becoming economically unviable. So it's my profound hope that the Prime Minister is listening to this set of advice and not to the National Energy Board. David Hughes, who is an energy geologist that used to work for the federal government, he's done a report, and he gives the benefit of the doubt to the petroleum industry. He assumes that they're going to have one liquefied natural gas export terminal on the west coast. And he assumes that tar sands are going to expand up to the limit that the Notley government set of 100 megatons. Now, we don't want that to happen, but for the benefit of the argument, let's assume that happens. Then he takes the target that under the Harper government, and he says that if that were to happen, that would take up 45% of Canada's allowable emissions in 2020, meaning the whole rest of the economy would have to make up for that. And 47% of reductions would have to come out of the rest of the economy. Probably mathematically impossible. So it's kind of a reductio ad absurdum argument based on the official figures. The Policy Horizons Canada document doesn't give a lot of numbers, so I looked up some of my own about how viable renewable energy is becoming. And this is simply about the capacity of global wind power and how in 11 years it's grown 10 times from 31 gigawatts to 381 gigawatts. That's just how it's growing at a pace that nobody predicted. A few years ago they would have said, no, it won't be that fast. But the growth is belying what happened. And the next slide is a similar one for solar power. The axis on the left is the price of solar panels. And you see back in 1975, $101 per watt. And over in 2015, 61 cents. And so the axis on the right is showing the growth of solar panel installations. As the price came down, the industry expanded. So it's really phenomenal what is happening. What does this mean for Canada? Let's just move to the last slide. This is from a study by Jacobson and colleagues at Stanford University. And again, it's not exactly a prediction of where we're headed, but it's showing what's possible. What they looked at was, suppose we had no fossil fuels, no nuclear power, no burning of biomass. Could Canada in the year 2050 still meet its energy needs? And their answer is yes. And this is simply one possible outcome, relying on wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, and wave energy. It's not a prediction, but it shows what is possible. And so to conclude, I just want to say how hopeful I am that an alternate energy future is possible. And as we allies stand with Indigenous people, and if we can delay and get favorable court decisions to stop the expansion of the bitumen industry, we are doing our part to make this future possible. Thank you.
Every time I get behind a podium, I always think, can you see me? Buju, Heyushka Washtali, Red Sky Woman, Indigenous Kasmakwa, Dodem, Wood Mountain, Lakota Nation, Treaty 4 Territory, Saskatchewan. I just want to acknowledge being on Haudenosaunee, Anishnawbe, and Neutral Territory today as a guest. I want to also acknowledge the sacred bundle that I see in front of me, elders, respected leaders, grassroots activists, people from the religious community, academics, and all of the rest who are grandmothers, our beautiful grandmothers. So I just wanted to start out by explaining my introduction. And the reason I want to explain it is it relates to roles and responsibilities that I have in the community. So it's an identity that's been given to me through spirit, that's been passed on by my ancestors, gifts that have been given to me. Because anytime you're given something, you must always give something back. I'm a member of the Bear Clan, and my role and responsibility as a Bear Clan member is to protect and bring healing to the community. So it's not uncommon to hear me sounding my voice about issues brought forward to me by the community. It is a role and responsibility that I feel deeply passionate about, part of my identity that guides much of what I do. I also have been given the name Good Peacemaker Woman, Keyushka-Washtewi, and I was given that name many years ago, and that name comes with important roles and responsibilities that has also directed much of my work, which has been to get people to sit down together, from grassroots all the way up to leadership, to sit down and have difficult discussions. And it's a role that I've had and a responsibility that I've had to try and support peaceful resolutions. And that doesn't mean that it always turns out, but it does mean that I have to live up to my responsibility to support conversations that may lead to reconciling differences. And it's a sacred role and responsibility that I take seriously in truly honoring that responsibility when I was given that name. Because whenever we are given something, we must always give something back. My second name, Red Sky Woman, was given to me by Elder Judy De Silva, who's probably known to people in the room, a very well-respected elder, last summer during a fast that I was on. And when she gave me the name, she gifted me with this teaching. She said, this name is to help you with some of the work that you are doing, lobbying to end violence against Indigenous women, girls, because no matter where we are at night, no matter where we are, no matter what is happening, we all share the same sky. And that was a very profound teaching to me, because it reminds me that we are all responsible for each other, that everything is related and interconnected. We are responsible for each other, for all life. And it reminds me that when one person is affected by violence, social exclusion, racism, structural violence, systemic barriers, environmental racism, it impacts the flow of everyone and everything in the circle. And this includes the kind of violence that we see being perpetrated against our Mother Earth, a direct attack on our life givers, our sisters, our aunties, our daughters, our mothers, our grandmothers, sacred water carriers. And it's this violence that began during first contact, later legislated through paternalistic and racist legislation such as the Enfranchisement Act and the Indian Act, and continues on today through policies and societal structures that perpetuate unacceptable levels of poverty and violence towards Indigenous women and girls. Today, Indigenous women statistically have higher rates of poverty, the highest rates of homelessness, experience the highest rates of violence when compared to other Canadians. We are homeless and are on our own lands. And even our safety is at risk in many of our communities as a result of aggressive resource companies that bring workers left unsupervised, where we see even higher rates of sex trafficking, a greater access to alcohol and drugs provided to minors, making our young girls more vulnerable at the hands of their attackers. It is a direct attack on our life givers, our women, and our girls. And we see the same kind of violence being perpetrated against our lands as waters, as being inflicted upon our women. It is a system that is founded in patriarchal structures that still result in the rampant violence against all life, including Indigenous women and girls. It is violence that is supported through a neoliberal system that focuses on economic development without considerations on the impact on social well-being. A system that disregards life givers, Without water, there is no life. It is violence that has been allowed by a level of cognitive dissonance all too common in this country as we attempt to explore our violent colonial history that has resulted in divisions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people on our ancestral Indigenous lands. A colonial history that has resulted in poverty supported by racist and paternalistic legislation, such as I mentioned before, the Indian Act. As Canada gets rich off the resources located around our territories, many of our nations live in abject poverty. And as my sister here pointed out, living around the pollution and destruction as a result of uncontrollable greed. From our experiences in residential schools to child welfare systems, to the 60s scoop where thousands of children were apprehended and shipped off to the United States and Europe, a stripping away of our ancestral lands, the social determinants of health for Indigenous people has been severely compromised. Understanding history and where Canada's colonial history has led us is imperative. Going back in our shared history and reflecting upon historical disruptions to better understand why things are the way they are today is imperative. For families and communities who have experienced genocide, it's about relearning how to be together as a family, as a community, as a nation. Working together through all the cognitive dissonance that keeps this country sick. And in spite of attempts to silence our voices, Indigenous women and girls are taking back our rightful place as leaders in our community, our traditional roles and responsibility that were in place prior to the imposition of patriarchal structures. And we are being supported by Canadians from coast to coast who also want to see an end to violence against Indigenous women and girls, a protection of our sacred water carriers. We are the keepers of water. Without water, there is no life. And this is imperative at this turning point in history where we need to support a strong stance against pipeline developments and other aggressive resource extraction industries that further exacerbate the impacts of climate change, as we witness currently in Fort McMurray with the wildfires that are beginning to rage across Turtle Island. An environmental reality that has been caused by developments without a recognition for a need for balance, with a disregard for how all things are interrelated and interconnected, without an understanding of natural laws that when you put something into the circle, it comes back to you. A way of being in the world that is based on Eurocentric orientations that focus on benefit of the individual over the collective well-being of the whole community, of all life. A linear view that distorts the circle of life. With far too little attention paid towards supporting sustainable developments. Whenever you are given something, you must always give something back. And it is this very reality where I must honor my role and responsibility as an Indigenous woman to protect water, a role that extends beyond me as an individual, a return to my traditional roles and responsibilities as an Indigenous woman. Safely and free of violence. The kind of protection that our Mother Earth is calling out for right now. Our caregiver of life. And it's that kind of understanding rooted in Indigenous ways of knowing that the world is looking towards as we begin to fight for the survival of all creation. An identity that celebrates our ingenuity with all the wisdom that it entails. There's nothing simplistic about Indigenous ways of life. It is grounded in a sophisticated systems of knowledge that clearly demonstrate the need to be mindful of actions. Clearly embraces an understanding that every action causes a reaction. A way of life conducive to sustainable practice and inclusion, practices that the world hungers for during this time of global crisis. We need to start doing things differently. It is bigger than a partisan debate. The world is looking toward Indigenous ways of life as a possible solution. It is a discussion about how we can move forward in a manner that ensures the survival of the next generations. And many of the teachings about how to achieve this are rooted in Indigenous ways of knowing. Knowledge systems passed down from our ancestors, teachings that not only benefit Indigenous people, but the world that is looking to find solutions to address the complex situation that we currently find ourselves in. We are responsible for everyone and everything in our circle, walking softly on the earth, because everything is interrelated and interconnected. And this needs to go beyond talk and reflection. And it's time, I say, that we need to adopt and implement UNDRIP, and I'm very honored to have my partner Romeo Saganash here today to support me. But UNDRIP, as you know, is a declaration that ensures the human rights for Indigenous people are protected. And it also provides protection for Indigenous people around lands and waters. And this is crucial with pipeline development and mining industries where Canada has become rich off the resources, while our communities, often located beside major resource companies, receive no benefit. While Canada gets rich off our lands, we are left to deal with the impacts of environmental racism without clean drinking water, unsupervised workers from the resource companies perpetrating violence against women and girls, and our ability to access traditional food sources is destroyed further, intensifying food security and issues within our nation. And when I'm talking about adopting and implementing, I'm not talking about embracing. I don't know how you embrace UNDRIP. I'm not talking about implementing another program so another government can come in and cut the programs and we're left in destitute poverty with no protection. I'm talking about adopting and implementing with legislative changes. Because really, why isn't the government, who has indicated they're so committed to the human rights of Indigenous people, adequately stepping up to address the human rights crisis that continues to be a direct result of corporate exploitation in our communities? You see, there are choices. This government, like all other governments, are not victims of their predecessors. And maybe they are scared to adopt and implement UNDRIP because, and I'm just speculating, it may put the corporate fat cats who have funded much of their campaigns at risk. I mean, the Liberal government is heavily funded, as we all know, by the corporate elite, and this includes big oil. And the Liberal government needs to support actions to honor our original treaties. The Liberal government needs to take actions to hold corporations responsible for the abuse and destruction of our lands. There is no more time for placating this crisis in many of our nations through fluffy expressions of caring, like embracing UNDRIP rather than adopting and implementing UNDRIP. I mean, embracing sounds loving, right? Okay, but it's time to adopt and implement UNDRIP. The Liberal government needs to support Bill C-262 and adopt and implement UNDRIP as a framework for reconciliation in this country, as noted in recommendations 43 and 44 of the TRC report. And the Liberal government needs to stop pandering to the wants and desires of oil companies and immediately make substantial investments in sustainable energy to ensure the survival of all life, waters, animals, plants, and humans. There is no more time to wait. We must act swiftly to protect Mother Earth. Thank you very much.
I ran against Line 9. I ran the length of the pipeline from so-called Sarnia to Montreal. The pipeline is 837 kilometers in length. It passes through or nearby 18 First Nations reserves with no consent, in violation of Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. I actually arrived late to this event. I'm really sorry, so I didn't get to hear Myeengun speak. But essentially, Line 9 is 40 years old. It has been determined by an engineer to have an over 90% chance of rupture within the first 5 years, and it started running on December 4th. So it's not a question of if there will be a spill, it's a question of when. And the pipeline was designed to carry conventional oil. It's had 35 reported significant spills already. Enbridge is notorious for not reporting spills. But the contents have been switched to diluted bitumen, which is thicker and heavier than peanut butter. At room temperature, at 11 degrees Celsius, diluted bitumen is as hard as a hockey puck. Pardon me, bitumen is as hard as a hockey puck. It's got to be diluted with toxic corrosive chemicals, so corrosive they thin the wall of a brand new pipeline up to 95%, as shown with Keystone 1. So that's now happening with this pipeline, is it's corroding the walls. Line 9 passes through every major tributary to Lake Ontario. It bisects very ecologically sensitive lands as well. So I ran it with great support from Chippewas of the Thames. I'm very thankful they offered me a support vehicle and places to stay and food, and were so incredibly generous. And I hesitate to call myself an ally. I don't like the word ally because I don't expect a card, like an official ally. I don't think anyone can get that. I don't think it's a thing we should be striving towards. Harsha Walia is an author who uses the term ethical relationships. I think it's our job to really learn what our ancestors have done on this land and what we continue to perpetuate. What happened here is it fits the legal definition of apartheid precisely. Putting brown-skinned people apart from you on reserve is not legal. It's not cool. You don't get to create a country off of that. The genocide that happened here is real. We have to acknowledge that, and it's still happening today. When we hear about 3 girls being born for every boy in Aamjiwnaang, that's genocide. That's a male population that's being lost. The genocide is continuing to this day. We have to acknowledge that. We have to do the work. We have Google. We can work. We can learn. We should not be putting the onus on Indigenous people to explain to us what we should be doing. Obviously, forming ethical relationships is a great thing, but we must be doing that work within ourselves. And Line 9, we have to stop Line 9. It's so terrifyingly dangerous. It violates Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. If there's going to be a Canadian Constitution, we should be respecting it. The Canadian Constitution violates the treaties, but that's a different story. We should be looking at the Tua Wampum is the treaty for this area here. Living within that treaty, the treaty is in the Indigenous tradition. This is Indigenous land. We have to absolutely be respecting that, regardless of what Trudeau does. And a great place to start is listening to Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, who are clearly saying they don't want this pipeline. Going to the Supreme Court, November 30th. Please support Chippewas of the Thames First Nation in their efforts. I will get off this podium now. Thank you very much.
When we leave here today, when we develop a plan of action, when we go forward to take what we've gathered here today, can we make an impact? Can we make an impact on politicians? Can we make an impact on the public policy debate that's going forward? And I was asked to address this not only because of my role at the Centre for Public Ethics that I spoke about at the opening of this conference, but also because I am a former politician. I spent about 20 years, part of it in Ottawa as an advisor to a number of ministers and the Prime Minister, and then as 11 years as an elected official at Queen's Park. And my answer to that question, can we make a difference, is a resounding yes. People of faith have a very, very important role to play in the public square. Yes, we live in a secular society, and yes, everyone should have a right to believe whatever they believe, But that means that people of faith should have an equal voice, and they should come forward. And more importantly than that, more importantly than our rights as people of faith, and I'm a person of faith, I struggle with the issue of being a politician, a person of faith for decades. One thing I recognize is not only do we have a right to come forward, but we also tend to have very, very good ideas. And the reason why people of faith have good ideas is that we're one of the few, I think, interest groups or advocacy groups that are not coming from a perspective of self-interest. We're coming from a perspective of concern about the other, in the case of what we're talking about today, concern about the common good, concern about our planet. And when you come with that sort of concern, different things happen, whether you're an elected official or whether you're an advocate. You start to think about things from a different perspective. You start to think about those who are on the margins. You start to think about the poor. You start to think about those whose voices are not always heard. And you start to think about our obligations to each other. And when you do that, you start to think about policies differently, and you start to think about resources differently. And politics is really about resources. There's only a certain amount of capacity in the system for policy change. There's only a certain amount of tax dollars that exist out there. And the question for every politician is, how do you allocate them? How do you pull them together? How do you put them forward? And the fact is that people of faith help you to think differently about it and start to shape those priorities around the common good, around those who don't have that voice, around the marginalized. And people of faith have had a tremendous impact. If you feel ever down or perhaps a little bit frustrated, think about the role that faith communities and individuals of faith played when it came to issues like slavery and the civil rights movement, or here in Canada, much more recently, the movement around apartheid in South Africa and Namibia, the work that was done, and it's been mentioned several times, the fight to get Aboriginal rights in the Constitution. People of faith were there beside our Aboriginal communities to fight for it. This is a very, very strong tradition that we're part of, and we should feel very heartened and I think encouraged as we go out to talk about these very, very important issues. But I am going to put two warnings forward. And that is that we have an opportunity to go forward and to remind our elected officials, to remind each other, because it's about a collective responsibility, and I think that case has been made over and over again today. But to talk about the importance of climate justice, to talk about the problems that are facing our society. What we don't have the right to do is to go forward and say, we're right, you're wrong, and we've got God on our side. Not only is that, and friends, it happens, because not only is that theologically and ethically unsound, but politically it's not going to get you anywhere. It's about going forward with a very positive message, but also going forward knowing that, and I think, again, people have said this over and over again up here in the various panels and speakers, we don't have all the answers. There's a wonderful term a favorite author of mine uses, moral ambiguity. I spoke about ethical dilemmas. And yes, there's nothing ambiguous about our need to address climate change, our need for reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples. But how we get there, there's lots of ambiguity, there's lots of dilemmas. And I think what we have to do is we have to say we're people of faith, we're concerned about this, we're bringing we're putting forward great ideas, we're putting forward ideas based on selflessness, based on love for humanity, but we don't have all the answers. And we're prepared to meet people halfway. We're prepared to listen to people. We're prepared even to sit down with the other side, with people whose views we may never feel we'll ever agree with, in order to understand them, in order to find that middle ground. Demonizing people doesn't get us anywhere. It's about dialogue and it's about reaching out. I began this morning, when I welcomed you here today, talking about the mandate of the Center for Public Ethics, and it's about building a public. And I think today what we've seen through the panels, through the speakers, through the discussions that we've had at the table is really, and I know all of you represent publics on your own, but I think we've come together to a new public. So be proud that we've done that, and be proud that each of us now have a mandate, all of us collectively as a public, to go forward and fight for these very, very important issues. So I think it was a little less than the 55 minutes, but once again, thank you for coming out today. Thank you for giving of your time for such an important and crucial issue.